The summer of 1873 arrived in Kansas like a fever, hot, relentless, and carrying with it the promise of change that nobody asked for. The wheat stood tall in the Vance family fields, golden and heavy with the kind of harvest that made a man believe his labor meant something. Caleb Vance, 19 years old and still believing the world operated on principles of fairness, walked between the rows with his older brother Elias, their boots crunching on the dry earth. "Pa says the railroad surveyors came by again yesterday," Elias said, pulling a strand of wheat and examining the grain with the practiced eye of someone who'd spent his whole life working this land. At 24, Elias had their father's build, broad-shouldered and solid as oak, but their mother's eyes deep brown and capable of remarkable gentleness. Third time this month. Caleb stopped walking. What'd they want this time? Same thing they always want. Elias tossed the wheat stalk aside. Our land. Offered Pa $200 for 40 acres. 200? Caleb felt anger kindle in his chest. That's robbery. This land's worth 10 times that at least. Try telling them that. Elias's jaw tightened. They're not really asking, little brother. They're informing. The railroad's coming through whether we like it or not. The Vance farmstead sat 3 miles outside of Redemption, a town that had grown from a trading post to a proper settlement in less than a decade. The farm itself had been in the family for 2 generations, 120 acres of good Kansas soil that Samuel Vance had worked himself half to death to maintain. Their mother, Rebecca, kept a garden that was the envy of every woman in the county, and their younger sister, Mary, at 14, was already showing the same stubborn determination that seemed to run in the Vance bloodline. But none of that mattered to the Continental Pacific Railroad Company. The railroad had been pushing west for years, connecting the frontier to the established cities of the East with bands of iron and the promise of prosperity. Towns along its route exploded overnight. Those bypassed withered and died. The Continental Pacific didn't just build railroads, it made and broke entire communities with the stroke of a pen on a map. And now they wanted redemption. More specifically, they wanted the land between Redemption and the river, which meant they wanted the Vance farm, along with a dozen others. Pa's not going to sell, Caleb said with certainty. Elias gave him a look that made Caleb feel like a child. You think they care what Pa wants? That evening, the family gathered around the dinner table in the farmhouse kitchen. Rebecca had made her famous chicken stew, but nobody seemed to have much appetite. Samuel Vance sat at the head of the table, his weathered hands folded in front of him, his face carved with lines that spoke of 30 years of frontier life. Tell them what you heard in town, Pa, Mary said, her young face troubled. Samuel cleared his throat. Ben Morrison's selling, so's the Kellerman family. The railroad's offering them contracts to work on the line itself. Seems generous until you realize they'll be making half what they made farming, and they'll owe everything to the company's store. They can't make us sell, Rebecca said, but there was uncertainty in her voice. No, they can't make us, Samuel agreed. But they can make it so difficult we'll have no choice. They've got the territorial governor in their pocket, most of the judges too. I heard they've already started filing eminent domain claims on some properties. Eminent domain? Caleb looked to Elias, who'd spent more time in town and understood these legal terms better. Means the government can take private land for public use, Elias explained, his voice bitter. They claim the railroad benefits everyone, so individual property rights don't matter. They take your land, pay you what they decide it's worth, and if you don't like it, you can hire a lawyer, which costs more money than they're offering in the first place. That's not law, Caleb said hotly. That's theft with paperwork. Welcome to the frontier, little brother. Elias pushed his bowl away, stew barely touched. The law is whatever the man with the most money says it is. Samuel raised a hand. We're not going to panic. I've sent word to Henry Blackwood. He's a lawyer out of Topeka, supposedly honest. He'll come out next week and review our deed, make sure everything's in order. We've got rights, and we're going to exercise them. But Caleb saw the worry in his father's eyes, the way his mother's hands trembled slightly as she cleared the table. Rights only mattered if someone with power decided to respect them. The Continental Pacific Railroad Company didn't respect much of anything except their profit margins and their timetables. The railroad's local agent was a man named Thornton Webb, and he arrived at the Vance farm 3 days later in a polished carriage that looked obscenely out of place on the dirt road. Webb himself was tall and thin, dressed in a suit that probably cost more than the Vances made in a year, with slicked back hair and cold eyes that assessed everything like a merchant taking inventory. Caleb and Elias were repairing a section of fence when the carriage rolled up. They watched Webb step down, flanked by two men who were clearly hired muscle, thick-necked brutes with guns on their hips and the dead-eyed look of men who'd done violence and would do it again without hesitation. "You boys the Vance sons?" Webb called out, not bothering to approach them. "Who's asking?" Elias straightened, wiping his hands on his pants. "Thornton Webb, representing the Continental Pacific. Your father home?" "He's in the North Field. What do you want?" Webb smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Just a friendly conversation about the future. The railroad's coming through this territory, and we're offering very generous compensation to landowners willing to sell. I'd like to discuss terms with Mr. Vance." "He's not interested," Caleb said. Webb's smile faded. "That's not your decision to make, boy. Where'd you say he was?" "I didn't." Elias moved to block the path toward the house. "And we're not boys. This is private property, and you're not welcome here. You can leave your offer with us, and if Pa's interested, he'll contact you." The two hired men tensed, hands drifting toward their weapons. Webb held up a hand, stopping them. "I see," Webb said softly. "I'd hoped we could handle this civilly, but I sense some resistance. Let me make something clear, gentlemen. The Continental Pacific has been granted right-of-way through this territory by the territorial government. We're moving forward with or without your cooperation. The only question is whether your family profits from this inevitability or gets crushed beneath it." "That sounds like a threat," Caleb said, his heart pounding but his voice steady. "It's a reality." Webb turned back toward his carriage. "You have 1 week to reconsider. After that, we'll file the necessary legal papers and take this land through eminent domain. You'll get whatever a judge decides is fair, which I promise you will be considerably less than what we're offering now." He climbed back into the carriage. Just before the door closed, he leaned out and added, "Oh, and boys, accidents happen to people who stand in the way of progress. Your father might want to consider that when he's making his decision. Fires, mostly. Awful hard to fight a blaze way out here, miles from town. Sometimes entire families get caught in them." The carriage rolled away, leaving Caleb and Elias standing in the dust. "He just threatened to burn us out," Caleb said, disbelief and fury warring in his voice. "Worse than that." Elias's face had gone pale. "He threatened to burn us in." They found Samuel in the North Field and told him everything. Their father listened in silence, his jaw clenching tighter with every word. When they finished, he stood there for a long moment, staring at the wheat that represented a year of hard work and hope. "We're not selling," he finally said. "I don't care what they threaten. This land is ours. My father died bringing this land under cultivation. I'll be damned if I let some railroad company steal it because they've got lawyers and guns." "Pa, they're talking about burning the house," Elias said carefully. "With us in it. Then we'll take precautions. We'll take turns keeping watch at night. We'll make sure we've got weapons ready." Samuel met his son's eyes. "But we're not running, and we're not selling. There has to be law that means something, even out here. If we don't stand up now, what kind of world are we leaving for Mary? For your children someday?" Caleb felt a surge of pride in his father, mixed with cold fear, because he'd seen the look in Thornton Webb's eyes. That man wasn't making idle threats. That night, they held a meeting at the farmhouse with several other families who'd also refused to sell. The Morrisons, who Samuel had said were planning to accept the railroad's offer, didn't come. Neither did the Kellermans. But Jacob and Sarah Pruitt showed up, along with their 2 teenage sons. The McAllister family came, old Tom McAllister with his wife Martha and their grown daughter Anne. A few others trickled in, maybe 15 people total. "They're using intimidation because the law's on their side," Jacob Pruitt said. He was a gruff man, built like a bull, with a reputation for being stubborn as one too. "I spoke to a lawyer in Wichita. He said the railroad's claims of eminent domain are legally shaky at best, but it doesn't matter. They've got judges who will rule in their favor regardless." "So what do we do?" Sarah Pruitt asked. She was a small woman, but her voice carried steel. "We can't fight them in court if the courts are corrupt." "We make it expensive for them," Tom McAllister said. The old man had fought in the Mexican War and didn't scare easily. "They want to bully us, fine, but every day we hold out costs them money. Railroad construction is on a schedule. Investors get nervous when schedules slip. We make them hurt financially. Maybe they'll negotiate in good faith. Or they'll escalate, Rebecca Vance said quietly. That Webb man essentially threatened to murder us in our beds. You think they'll hesitate to follow through if we become a real problem? Silence fell over the room. Everyone knew she was right. It was Elias who finally spoke. Then we protect each other. Nobody farms alone anymore. We work in groups, armed. We set up a watch rotation. Someone's always awake, always ready. And if the railroad wants to start a war, we make damn sure they know what they're getting into. You're talking about violence, Martha McAllister said, fear plain on her face. I'm talking about self-defense, Elias corrected. They're the ones making threats. We're just deciding whether we're going to be victims or whether we're going to fight back. The meeting broke up near midnight with a tentative plan in place. The families would coordinate their schedules, share resources, and most importantly, watch out for each other. If the railroad tried to move against one farm, they'd all respond. It was a good plan, born of desperation and solidarity. It lasted exactly 4 days. The fire started just after midnight on a moonless Tuesday. The Pruitt's barn went up like kindling, too fast, too hot to be natural. By the time Jacob and his sons got organized to fight it, the structure was beyond saving. They managed to get the livestock out, but the barn itself, along with the season's entire hay stores, was reduced to ash. When Samuel and Elias rode over at dawn, they found the family exhausted and shell-shocked. The teenage Pruitt boys, who'd been so eager to talk about fighting back just days before, looked scared now. Reality had arrived with smoke and flames. Any doubt it was set? Samuel asked Jacob quietly. Jacob shook his head. Found kerosene cans thrown in the wreckage. They weren't even trying to hide it. You report it to the sheriff? A bitter laugh. Sheriff Dalton? He's on the railroad's payroll. He came out this morning, looked around for about 5 minutes, and said it was probably vagrants. Suggested we be more careful about securing our property. Jacob spat in the dirt. That bastard knows exactly who did this. Sarah Pruitt sat on the porch of their farmhouse, her face in her hands. Caleb, who'd ridden over with his father and brother, heard her sobbing. The sound made something twist in his gut. We can't let them get away with this, he said to his brother. Elias looked at the smoking ruins of the barn. What do you suggest? We know it was the railroad, but we can't prove it. And even if we could, who would we tell? Every authority figure in 50 miles is in their pocket. Then we make them pay a different way. Caleb, they burned the Pruitt's barn. What if we burned something of theirs? That's... Elias stopped, looking at his younger brother with an expression somewhere between shock and consideration. That's escalation. That's declaring war. They declared war when they threatened to burn Ma and Mary alive in their beds, Caleb shot back. We're just deciding whether to surrender or shoot back. The Pruitt fire lit something in Caleb that he hadn't known was there. A cold, calculating anger that pushed aside his natural optimism and faith in the system. He'd always believed that right would eventually prevail, that honest work and moral character meant something. But watching Sarah Pruitt weep over the ashes of her family's livelihood, knowing the men responsible would never face consequences, that belief began to crack. The railroad had made the rules clear. Power mattered, money mattered, and law was just a tool to legitimize theft. Fine. Caleb could learn to play by those rules. Over the next week, 3 more farms were hit. The McAllisters had their well poisoned with lie. The Henderson family, who'd been sitting on the fence about selling, woke up to find all 4 of their horses shot dead in the pasture. The message was brutally clear: sell or be destroyed. One by one, families started accepting the railroad's offers. The Hendersons left within days. The McAllisters held out another week before Old Tom finally admitted defeat and took the money. The solidarity that had seemed so strong at that midnight meeting evaporated like morning dew under the harsh sun of reality. Only the Vances and the Pruitts remained. We should sell, Rebecca said one evening. The family sat around the dinner table, but the normal warmth of the meal was absent. Fear had moved into the house like a cold draft that no fire could chase away. Samuel, I know what this land means, but it's not worth our lives. If we sell, what message does that send Mary? Samuel's voice was weary. He'd aged 10 years in the past month. That bullies always win? That the strong can take what they want from the weak? It sends the message that we're smart enough to recognize a fight we can't win, Rebecca replied. Pride doesn't matter if we're dead. Mary, who'd been silent throughout dinner, suddenly spoke up. I saw Thornton Webb in town yesterday. He asked how our family was doing, asked if we'd had any accidents yet. Her voice shook. He smiled when he said it, Ma, like he was looking forward to it. The table fell silent. Caleb met Elias's eyes across the table and saw his own anger reflected back at him. This had gone beyond a business dispute. The railroad wasn't just trying to buy land anymore. They were terrorizing families for sport. That night, Caleb and Elias slipped out of the house after everyone else had gone to bed. They met the Pruitt sons, Thomas and Robert, at a spot halfway between their properties. The four young men sat in the darkness, speaking in low voices. My paw's about ready to break, Thomas Pruitt said. He was 17, built like his father, with his mother's eyes. Another week of this, he'll sell. Same with ours, Elias said. We need to change the equation. How? Robert Pruitt was younger, only 15, but there was a hardness in his face that shouldn't have been there at his age. The fire had changed him. Caleb spoke up. The railroad's got a supply depot outside of Redemption. Rails, ties, tools, everything they need for construction. It's not well guarded. Maybe 4 men on watch. You're talking about sabotage, Thomas said slowly. I'm talking about making it expensive for them to keep terrorizing us, Caleb corrected. They burned your barn, killed the Henderson horses, poisoned the McAllister well. They've done thousands of dollars in damage to innocent families. Maybe it's time they felt some economic pain, too. Elias shook his head. If we get caught, we won't get caught, Caleb interrupted. We'll be smart about it. Hit them fast, hit them hard, and disappear. And if we do get caught, you know what they do to saboteurs? Caleb met his brother's eyes. What are they going to do if we don't fight back, Elias? What's the end game here? We watch our families get terrorized until they give up and sell for pennies on the dollar? Then we move on, find new land, hope the next railroad company or mining operation or cattle baron is more reasonable? The four young men sat in silence, each wrestling with the same question. At what point did self-defense become criminality? At what point did fighting back against injustice become the very lawlessness they were supposed to oppose? I'm in, Thomas Pruitt finally said. Robert? Elias looked at the younger boy. They burned our barn, Robert said simply. I'm in. Elias turned to Caleb. This changes everything. You understand that? Once we do this, there's no going back. The railroad won't just threaten us anymore. They'll come with guns. They were always going to come with guns, Caleb said. At least this way, we're not making it easy for them. 3 nights later, the 4 of them crept through the darkness toward the railroad depot. They'd spent 2 days watching the guard rotations, learning the patterns. The depot was situated in a hollow about 2 miles from town, far enough from prying eyes, but close enough to the construction route to be practical. 4 guards, just as Caleb had said, but guards who were bored, sleepy, convinced that their employer's intimidation tactics had worked and nobody would dare strike back. They were wrong. The Vance brothers and the Pruitt boys moved like ghosts through the night. Years of hunting in these hills had taught them how to move silently, how to use terrain and shadows. They split into 2 pairs, Elias and Thomas circling from the north, Caleb and Robert from the south. The guards never saw them coming. They didn't kill anyone. That was a line none of them were ready to cross yet. But they'd brought rope and gags, and the guards, taken by surprise, went down without a shot fired. Within 15 minutes, all 4 were bound and gagged in one of the depot's supply sheds. Then the real work began. They couldn't burn the depot. Fire would be visible for miles and would bring everyone running, but they could make it economically painful. They went through the supply yard systematically, destroying what they could. Rails were pried up and thrown in the river. Wooden ties were split with axes. Tools were collected and scattered across miles of countryside where they'd never be found. Kerosene, the same weapon used against the Pruitt barn, was used to ruin sacks of cement and other materials. It took them 3 hours, working in almost total silence, driven by fury and fear and a grim satisfaction at finally striking back. As dawn approached, they melted back into the hills. Behind them, the depot lay in ruins, thousands of dollars in damage, weeks of construction delays. The railroad would know this wasn't random vagrants or an accident. This was a message. You hurt us, we hurt you back. By noon the next day, the news had spread through Redemption like wildfire. The railroad depot had been destroyed, the guards found bound and humiliated, but unharmed. Sheriff Dalton was asking questions, but nobody seemed to know anything. A few people who'd sold to the railroad looked worried. Those who'd resisted allowed themselves small, secret smiles. Thornton Webb arrived in Redemption that evening in a fury. He stormed into the sheriff's office and could be heard shouting through the walls. When he emerged, his face was set in hard lines. He went straight to the Vance farm. Caleb and Elias were working in the barn when they saw the carriage approaching, this time with 6 armed men riding alongside. They exchanged glances, then moved to meet the group in the yard. Samuel emerged from the house, Rebecca and Mary staying inside but visible through the window. Webb stepped down from his carriage, his earlier false civility completely gone. "Where were you last night, Vance? You and your sons?" "On our property, same as always," Samuel said evenly. "Why?" The Continental Pacific Supply Depot was vandalized. Thousands of dollars in damage. Very professional job. Someone who knew what they were doing, understood what would hurt us most. Webb's eyes moved between Caleb and Elias. "You boys know anything about that?" "Not a thing," Elias said calmly. "But whoever did it sounds like they had good reason. You've been terrorizing families for weeks. Maybe someone decided to push back." Webb's face reddened. "That's an accusation you can't prove." "Same as you can't prove we had anything to do with your depot," Caleb said. "Funny how that works, isn't it?" For a long moment, the yard was silent, except for the sound of horses shifting and leather creaking. The 6 armed men had their hands near their weapons. Caleb knew his brother was carrying his pistol tucked in his belt, knew his father had a rifle just inside the barn door. The situation was balanced on a knife's edge. Webb finally spoke, his voice low and venomous. "You people think you're clever, think you're standing up for your rights, but you're just making this harder on yourselves. The railroad is coming through. It's inevitable. All you're doing is ensuring that when it does, you get nothing. And I mean nothing. Not money, not mercy, nothing." "Then I guess we have nothing to lose," Samuel said. Webb climbed back into his carriage. "You're wrong about that, Vance. You have a wife, a daughter. You have everything to lose, and if you're not careful, you'll find out exactly how much." The carriage rolled away, the armed men following. Rebecca came out of the house, her face white. "Samuel, he just threatened Mary." "I know." Samuel's hands were shaking with rage. "I know." That night, the Vance family didn't sleep. They sat in the main room, weapons ready, listening to every creak and groan of the house, every whisper of wind outside. But no attack came. The railroad was apparently planning its next move, deciding how to respond to this unexpected resistance. The answer came 3 days later, but not in the way anyone expected. The Pruitt farmhouse burned to the ground at dawn. This time, they didn't target an outbuilding or livestock. They came for the family itself. Jacob and Sarah Pruitt died in the fire, along with young Robert. Only Thomas survived because he'd been sleeping in the barn, the rebuilt barn, constructed hastily after the first one burned. Thomas made it to the Vance farm just after sunrise, his clothes singed, his face blackened with soot, his eyes wild with shock and grief. Caleb caught him as he stumbled into the yard, nearly falling. "They're gone," Thomas kept saying over and over. "They're all gone." "They locked the doors, Caleb. They nailed the doors shut and burned the house. I heard my mother screaming. I heard—" He collapsed, sobbing, and Caleb held him, feeling his own tears streaming down his face. This wasn't a business dispute anymore. This wasn't even terrorism. This was murder, pure and simple. And everyone knew the railroad had done it. Samuel rode into Redemption within the hour and demanded that Sheriff Dalton arrest Thornton Webb and his men. The sheriff listened with a bored expression, then told Samuel there was no evidence linking the railroad to the fire. These things happened on the frontier, tragic accidents, he called them. Perhaps the Pruitts had been careless with their lamps. When Samuel threatened to go over his head to contact the territorial governor, the sheriff just smiled. "Governor Morton's a personal friend of the Continental Pacific's president," Dalton said. "But you go ahead and write that letter, Mr. Vance. I'm sure it'll get all the attention it deserves." Samuel returned home that evening a changed man. Caleb and Elias saw it in his eyes. The last vestiges of faith in the system had died. The law didn't protect them. It protected those with money and power. They were on their own. That night, the family held a council. Thomas Pruitt was there too, staying with them now. An orphan at 17, everything he'd known reduced to ashes. "We can't fight them," Rebecca said, but there was defeat in her voice now rather than hope. "Samuel, they'll kill us. They've already proven they'll murder women and children. We can't protect ourselves against that." "So we run?" Samuel's voice was hollow. "We abandon our land, everything we've worked for, and just run? If it keeps Mary alive, yes." Rebecca's voice broke. "I watched Sarah Pruitt yesterday at church. I talked to her. She was planning to make jam this week, and now she's dead, burned alive in her own home. I won't let that happen to Mary. I won't let that happen to us." Caleb looked at Thomas Pruitt, who sat with his head in his hands, and felt something inside himself fundamentally shift. The railroad had taken this young man's entire family. They'd killed 3 people and would face absolutely no consequences for it. The law wouldn't touch them. The authorities wouldn't even investigate. "There's another option," Caleb said quietly. Everyone turned to look at him. "We make them pay," he continued. "Not their property, not their supplies. Them. The men who did this." "Caleb," his father said warningly. "They murdered the Pruitts, Pennsylvania. You went to the sheriff, you tried to do it the right way. And what happened? Nothing. Because there is no right way. The system is broken. It's designed to protect people like Webb and crush people like us." Caleb's voice grew stronger. "So maybe it's time we stopped pretending the law matters and took justice into our own hands." "You're talking about killing," Rebecca whispered. "I'm talking about execution," Caleb corrected. "There's a difference. The law won't punish murderers, so we do it ourselves. Webb and his men took 3 lives. They owe a debt, and I say we collect it." Elias was nodding slowly. Thomas Pruitt raised his head, and there was something fierce and terrible in his eyes. "No," Samuel said firmly. "I won't have my sons become murderers, even if the men deserve it. That path leads to hell, Caleb. You start down that road, there's no coming back." "Maybe," Caleb said. "But at least we'd be alive. At least Mary would be safe. How many more families have to burn before we stop trying to be civilized with people who understand nothing but violence?" The argument raged late into the night. Rebecca begged them to reconsider. Samuel held firm that violence would only make things worse. But Caleb could see his father's resolve weakening. After watching the Pruitts die and seeing justice denied, Samuel's moral certainty was crumbling. The debate was still ongoing when they heard horses approaching, multiple horses, moving fast. "Everyone inside," Samuel ordered, grabbing his rifle. "Elias, you cover the back. Caleb, upstairs window. Mary, you and your mother get in the cellar." They moved quickly, taking up defensive positions. Through the window, Caleb counted 6 riders approaching the house, silhouettes in the moonlight. His heart hammered in his chest as he checked his rifle, an old Spencer repeater that had served his father during the war. The riders pulled up in the yard and a voice called out, "Vance, we need to talk!" It wasn't Thornton Webb. The voice was different, younger, less refined. Samuel cracked the door open, rifle at the ready. "Say what you need to say from there." One of the riders dismounted and moved into the light spilling from the house. Caleb got a better look at him. Mid-20s, wearing trail clothes, a gun belt slung low. But his face was open, not threatening. "Name's Cole Hastings," the man said. "I run cattle about 20 miles west. The railroad's been trying to buy a strip of my land for their route. I said no. They burned my foreman's house last night, killed his dog, left a note saying I was next." Samuel's grip on the rifle didn't loosen. "What's that got to do with us?" "Word is you've been fighting back, heard about the depot, heard you're not backing down." Cole Hastings glanced at the other riders. "There's about 20 of us, property owners throughout the territory, all getting the same treatment from the continental Pacific. Figured maybe it's time we stopped fighting as individuals and started working together. Working together how? Elias had come to stand beside his father. However we need to, Cole said bluntly. The law won't protect us. The governor won't help us. We've got two choices. Surrender everything or band together and make the railroad think twice about their tactics. I'm here to see which choice you've made. Samuel looked back at his family, then at Thomas Pruitt, and finally at the vast darkness beyond where the railroad was steadily consuming the frontier like a plague. Come inside, he finally said. Let's talk. The meeting lasted until dawn. By the time Cole Hastings and his men rode away, the shape of something larger had formed. Not quite an organization, but a network. A resistance. 20 families spread across 200 miles, all united by a common enemy and a common resolve. They would not be victims. Plans were made. Resources would be pooled. Information would be shared. And when the railroad struck at one family, the others would strike back, harder and more coordinated than individual acts of desperation. It wasn't quite an outlaw gang, not yet. But Caleb could see how easily it could become one. When the law failed, people created their own justice. And justice, without the restraints of civilization, often looked a lot like vengeance. As the sun rose on what would be the last peaceful day the Vance family would ever know, Caleb stood on the porch and watched the horizon. Somewhere out there, Thornton Webb was planning his next move. The railroad wasn't going to back down just because a few farmers had decided to fight back. This was war now, even if nobody had officially declared it. And war, Caleb was about to learn, had a way of turning ordinary people into exactly the kind of monsters they'd once feared. The transformation had already begun. He could feel it inside himself, that cold, hard thing that had replaced his natural optimism. The part of him that looked at Thornton Webb and the Continental Pacific's hired guns and calculated not how to avoid them or reason with them, but how to hurt them. His mother saw it too. Before he went inside, she came out onto the porch and took his hand. "You're changing," she said softly. "I can see it in your eyes, both you and Elias. This fight is changing you." "We don't have a choice, Ma." "There's always a choice, Caleb." She touched his cheek. "But I understand. You're doing what you think is right, trying to protect us. Just don't lose yourself completely. Promise me that, whatever happens, you'll remember who you are. You're not a killer. You're my son." Caleb wanted to promise her that. Wanted to believe it himself. But looking at the sunrise painting the sky in shades of red that looked too much like blood and fire, he wasn't sure that promise was his to make anymore. The railroad had started this war. The Vance brothers and their allies would finish it. And when it was over, nothing, not the land, not the law, not Caleb himself, would ever be the same. The alliance Cole Hastings had forged lasted exactly 3 weeks before the railroad showed them what real power looked like. It started with the Henderson family, or what was left of them. They'd sold out weeks ago, taken the railroad's money, and moved to Missouri. But they'd made the mistake of talking to a newspaper reporter from Kansas City about the intimidation tactics they'd witnessed. The article ran on a Tuesday, painting the Continental Pacific in brutal, unflattering detail. By Friday, the Hendersons' wagon was found overturned on the road outside of Independence. The entire family, father, mother, 3 children, murdered and left in a ditch like discarded refuse. The message was clear. Cooperation bought you nothing. Silence was mandatory. Resistance meant death. "They're escalating," Cole Hastings said. He'd ridden to the Vance farm with grim news and grimmer determination etched into his face, going after families who already sold out, who aren't even in the territory anymore. They're not just trying to take land, they're making an example. Samuel sat at the kitchen table, looking older than his years. The past month had carved new lines in his face, turned more of his hair gray. "What do you propose we do about it?" "Hit them where it hurts. Their supply lines, their equipment, their people." Cole's voice was hard. "We've been too careful, too restrained. Meanwhile, they're killing children and getting away with it. Time we remind them that fear works both ways." Elias stood by the window, watching the road. They'd maintained constant watch since the Pruitt murders, sleeping in shifts, always armed. "You're talking about ambushing their men, killing them." I'm talking about war, Cole corrected. Which is what this already is, except we've been fighting with one hand tied behind our backs while they're using both hands to choke us. Caleb felt that cold thing inside him stir again, that part of himself he barely recognized anymore. I'm in. Caleb, his father started. No, Pa. Caleb turned to face his family. His mother stood in the doorway to the kitchen, Mary beside her, both their faces tight with fear. I'm sorry, but Cole's right. We tried it the legal way. We tried defending ourselves passively. How many more people have to die before we accept that this isn't a fight we can win by being civilized? Thomas Pruitt, who'd been silent in the corner, spoke up. His voice was hollow, scraped raw by grief that hadn't dulled in the weeks since his family's murder. They burned my mother alive. My father tried to break down the door to save her, and they shot him through the window. I heard every second of it. He looked up, and his eyes were empty of everything except hate. Whatever you're planning, I want in. Boo. Rebecca moved into the room, her hands clasped together like she was physically holding herself together. And what happens when you boys start killing railroad men? You think they'll just accept that? They'll bring in more guns, more violence. This will never end. It's already not ending, Ma, Elias said quietly. We're just choosing whether to die on our knees or standing up. The argument could have gone on for hours, but it was cut short by the sound of rapid hoofbeats approaching. Everyone tensed, reaching for weapons, but the rider who burst into the yard was Jimmy Kelso, a 17-year-old who worked for the McAllister Ranch. He practically fell off his horse, gasping for breath. The railroad. They're moving on the Pritchard place right now. Must be 20 armed men. Slow down, Samuel ordered, catching the boy's shoulders. Take a breath and tell us exactly what you saw. Jimmy gulped air. I was riding the fence line when I saw them. 20, maybe 25 men, all armed, heading for the Pritchard farm. The Pritchards haven't sold yet. I think the railroad's going to do to them what they did to the Pruitts. Cole was already moving toward his horse. How long ago? 20 minutes, maybe less. Then we've got time. Cole turned to the assembled group. This is it. We can ride out there, stop this before it happens, or we can sit here and read about another family burning in their beds tomorrow. Your choice. The Vance men exchanged glances. Samuel looked at his wife, at Mary, at the sons who were already becoming something harder than the boys he'd raised. Some invisible line was about to be crossed, and everyone in that room knew it. Elias, Caleb, get the rifles, Samuel finally said. Rebecca, you and Mary get down to the cellar and stay there until we get back. If we're not back by dawn— Don't, Rebecca whispered. Don't say it. Samuel crossed to her and pulled her close. If we're not back by dawn, you take Mary and you run. There's money hidden in the barn, behind the third beam from the door. Take it and go to your sisters in Ohio. Don't look back. Tears streamed down Rebecca's face, but she nodded. Caleb grabbed his Spencer rifle and the bandolier of ammunition his father had brought back from the war. His hands were steady, his heartbeat calm. That should have frightened him, this readiness for violence, but he felt nothing except cold determination. Thomas already had his rifle. Elias emerged from the barn with his Winchester and a grim set to his jaw. Within 5 minutes, they were mounted and riding hard toward the Pritchard farm, Cole Hastings and his men alongside them. The Pritchard place was small, maybe 30 acres, but John Pritchard was stubborn as a mule and twice as ornery. He'd told Thornton Webb to go to hell in front of a dozen witnesses, and everyone knew the railroad would eventually make him pay for that defiance. They just hadn't expected it to happen tonight. The riders approached from the east, using the rolling hills for cover. As they crested the final rise, they could see the Pritchard farmhouse in the shallow valley below. And surrounding it, just as Jimmy had said, were at least 20 mounted men carrying torches and rifles. Thornton Webb sat on his horse in the middle of the group, directing the operation like a general commanding troops. Caleb could see the Pritchard family, John, his wife Emma, and their 3 young children, being dragged from the house and forced to their knees in the yard. They're going to execute them, Elias breathed, right there in front of the kids. Not if we stop them. Cole checked his rifle. We've got maybe 15 men. They've got 25. We'll need to be smart about this. Smart how? Samuel asked. We're outgunned and in the open. We've got surprise and high ground. Cole pointed to positions along the ridge. We spread out, Make them think there's more of us than there are. Put enough lead in the air, they'll break. Railroad men aren't soldiers. They're hired thugs used to terrorizing unarmed farmers. They won't stand up to real resistance. It was a desperate plan, but desperation was all they had. They dismounted and spread out along the ridgeline, each man finding cover behind rocks or brush. Caleb lay prone behind a boulder, his rifle resting on the stone, and sighted down at the scene below. He could hear Thornton Webb's voice carrying in the night air. "This is what happens to people who don't know when they're beaten, Pritchard. Your stubbornness has cost your family everything." Any last words? John Pritchard, kneeling in the dirt with a gun to his head, spat at Webb's feet. "You're a murdering bastard, and hell's waiting for you." Webb laughed. "Probably, but you'll get there first." He nodded to the man with the gun. "Do it." The gunshot that rang out didn't come from below. It came from Caleb's rifle. He'd aimed for the man holding the gun on John Pritchard, and his shot struck true. The railroad thug dropped like a puppet with cut strings, and chaos erupted. "Fire!" Cole shouted, and the ridgeline exploded with gunfire. The railroad men, caught completely by surprise, scattered in confusion. Some tried to return fire, shooting wildly at the ridge. Others dove for cover. Several bolted for their horses. In the pandemonium, John Pritchard and his family scrambled toward their house. "Keep shooting!" Elias yelled. "Don't let them regroup." Caleb worked the lever on his Spencer, firing as fast as he could aim. He didn't think about the men he was shooting at, didn't let himself consider that he was trying to kill them. They were just targets, threats to be eliminated. That cold part of himself had taken over completely, pushing aside doubt and fear and moral complexity. The railroad men were breaking. 5 were down, dead or wounded. The rest were mounting up, fleeing into the darkness. Thornton Webb screamed orders at them, trying to rally his forces, but fear was contagious and spreading fast. A bullet whined past Caleb's head, so close he felt the air move. He tracked the shooter, one of Webb's personal bodyguards, and fired back. The man jerked and fell backward off his horse. "They're running!" Thomas Pruitt shouted, and there was savage joy in his voice. "They're running!" It was true. The railroad men were in full retreat, thundering away into the night. Only Webb remained for a moment, sitting on his horse and staring up at the ridge with an expression of pure fury. Then he too wheeled his mount and galloped away. The gunfire faded, replaced by the ringing silence of aftermath. Smoke from the black powder hung in the air. Below, the Pritchard family emerged cautiously from their house, looking up at the ridge where their salvation had come from. "Did we just win?" one of Cole's men asked, disbelief evident in his voice. "We survived," Cole corrected. "That's not the same as winning." They rode down to the farmhouse, where John Pritchard met them with tears streaming down his face. His wife clutched their children, all of them shaking with shock. "You saved our lives," John said hoarsely. Webb was going to... "We know," Samuel said. "Pack what you can carry tonight. You and your family need to leave this territory by morning. The railroad will come back, and next time we might not be here." "But the farm?" "The farm is gone, John. Accept it." Samuel's voice was heavy with exhaustion and something like grief. "We bought you time to get out alive. Don't waste it by being stubborn." While the Pritchards hastily packed their most precious belongings, the resistance fighters examined the battlefield. 6 railroad men lay dead in the yard, 2 more wounded badly enough that they wouldn't survive the night without serious medical attention. Caleb stared at the man he'd shot first, the one who'd been about to execute John Pritchard. The bullet had caught him in the chest, probably hit the heart, dead before he hit the ground. Caleb had done that. He'd killed a man. He waited for guilt, for horror, for his humanity to reassert itself. But all he felt was a grim satisfaction that they'd stopped a murder, saved a family. That cold part of himself had no room for regret. "You're first?" Elias asked quietly, coming to stand beside him. "Yeah. How do you feel?" Caleb was silent for a long moment. "Like I'd do it again." Elias nodded slowly. "That's what scares me. Not that we had to do this. We did. But how easy it's getting to pull the trigger." They helped the Pritchards load their wagon, gave them directions to a safe route that would bypass redemption and the railroad's influence. As the family rolled away into the darkness, Emma Pritchard leaned from the wagon to call back, "Thank you, And may you find peace when this is over. Peace. The word sounded like something from another language, a concept from another life. The resistance fighters scattered before dawn, each group returning to their own properties. But as the Vance men rode home, they all knew something fundamental had changed. They'd crossed the line from defenders to aggressors, from victims to fighters. They'd killed men tonight, and while those men had deserved it, had been in the act of committing murder themselves, it still marked a transformation. The law, already stacked against them, would now have justification for its hostility. They weren't just resistors anymore. They were killers. Rebecca and Mary emerged from the cellar when they heard the horses, and the relief on Rebecca's face when she saw her men alive nearly broke Caleb's heart. But that relief transformed to something else when Samuel told her what had happened. "You killed them," she whispered. 8 men dead. 8 murderers, Caleb corrected. They were about to execute a family, Ma, including children. And now what? You think the railroad will just accept this? They'll bring in the army. They'll declare you outlaws and put bounties on your heads. Then we'll run, Elias said. But we're not going to stand by and watch innocent people die just because we're afraid of consequences. The consequences came faster than anyone expected. By noon the next day, Sheriff Dalton rode out to the Vance farm with a posse of 20 men and warrants for the arrest of Samuel, Elias, and Caleb Vance, along with Thomas Pruitt and Cole Hastings. The charges: murder, conspiracy, sabotage, and insurrection against lawful commerce. The bounty on each of their heads, $500, dead or alive. Samuel read the warrant while standing in his own yard, surrounded by armed men who'd been his neighbors just months ago, men who'd attended the same gatherings, worked the same harvest crews. But the railroad's money was good, and loyalty was expensive. "These warrants are based on the word of Thornton Webb," Samuel said, "a man who's been terrorizing this territory for months, who's burned farms and murdered families, and you're taking his word against ours?" Dalton shrugged. "I'm enforcing the law. You boys killed 8 railroad employees. That's murder, unless you can prove self-defense. And from what I understand, you ambushed them from a ridge. That don't sound like self-defense to me." "They were about to execute the Pritchard family," Elias said hotly. "So you say. Problem is, the Pritchards left the territory last night, so I can't exactly ask them, can I? Convenient, that." Dalton's smile was nasty. "You boys can come peaceful, or we can do this the hard way. Your choice." Caleb's hand drifted toward his gun, but his father caught his eye and shook his head slightly. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and Rebecca and Mary were in the house. Fighting here would only get everyone killed. "We'll come," Samuel said. "But this isn't over, Dalton. Everyone in this territory knows the railroad's been murdering people. Eventually someone's going to— "Going to what?" Dalton interrupted. "Write their congressman? Talk to a judge? Son, every person with power in this territory is in the Continental Pacific's pocket. There is no cavalry coming to save you. The sooner you accept that, the easier this will be." They were arrested without further resistance, hands bound, thrown into the back of a wagon like cargo. As they rolled away from the farm, Caleb looked back to see his mother and sister standing in the yard, both of them crying. He wondered if he'd ever see them again. The jail in Redemption was a crude affair: 4 cells, stone walls, bars that were solid but not impregnable. Samuel, Elias, Caleb, and Thomas were locked in 2 cells, 2 men to each. Cole Hastings had apparently gotten word of the warrants and fled before Dalton could catch him. "Smart man," Elias muttered. They spent 3 days in those cells while Dalton and the railroad prepared their case. A circuit judge was coming through the following week, and Thornton Webb was determined to see the Vance men hanged as quickly as possible. An example, he called it. A lesson to anyone else thinking about resistance. On the 3rd night, Rebecca came to visit. Dalton allowed her 10 minutes, standing close enough to hear every word. "Your lawyer arrived," she told Samuel quietly, speaking through the bars. "Henry Blackwood, the one you contacted months ago. He says the case is weak legally, but the judge is known to be sympathetic to railroad interests. He's not optimistic." "Tell him to do his best," Samuel said. "And Rebecca, if this goes badly, don't." Her voice broke. "Don't say goodbye to me yet." "I have to. If they hang us, you and Mary need to leave immediately. Go to your sisters, like we discussed. The railroad will come for the farm, but let them have it. Promise me." Rebecca nodded, tears streaming down her face. "I promise." After she left, the four men sat in silence. The reality was settling in. They were probably going to die. The trial would be a formality, justice already decided before the gavel fell, and their deaths would be legal, sanctioned, just another example of the frontier's harsh but lawful order. "I'm not hanging," Caleb said into the darkness. "I'm not giving them the satisfaction." "Not much choice in the matter," Thomas replied bitterly. "There's always a choice." Caleb was staring at the bars, his mind working. "These cells are solid, but the jail itself is barely watched at night. Dalton's got one deputy on duty after dark, and he's usually half drunk. If someone were to break us out—" "Who?" Elias asked. "Cole's gone. Everyone else is either too scared or already sold out." "Ma's not scared," Caleb said. "Neither is Mary." Samuel sat up straight. "Absolutely not. I won't have your mother and sister risking their lives on some desperate escape attempt." "Then we die in 6 days when the judge sentences us," Caleb shot back. "Those are the options, Pa. We wait for rescue that isn't coming, or we make our own opportunity." "He's right," Thomas said. "I've got nothing left except revenge. I'm not dying before I see Webb pay for what he did to my family. If there's a chance to get out of here, I'm taking it." The argument went on for hours. Voices kept low so the deputy wouldn't hear. Samuel resisted, but Caleb could see his father's resolve weakening. Because the truth was inescapable. Legal justice had failed them. Their only hope was the illegal kind. By morning, they had the bones of a plan. It required precise timing, tremendous luck, and a willingness to become everything the warrants accused them of being. But desperate men make desperate choices, and the alternative was death. Rebecca came again the next day, and this time Caleb was ready. While Dalton listened from across the room, Caleb had a seemingly innocent conversation with his mother about the weather, the crops, Mary's well-being. But woven into that conversation, spoken carefully and with deliberate emphasis, was another message entirely. Rebecca was smart enough to catch it. Her eyes widened slightly when she understood what he was asking her to do, and for a moment Caleb thought she'd refuse. But then something hardened in her face, that same stubborn determination that had made her a frontier woman in the first place. "Mary sends her love," Rebecca said, her voice steady. "She wanted me to tell you she's learning to shoot, getting quite good at it, actually. She hit the barn door from 50 yards yesterday, around midnight." Caleb felt a surge of hope. "Tell her I'm proud of her, and that timing is everything when you're shooting. Wait for the right moment, and you can hit anything." Dalton, listening but not really hearing, just grunted. "Time's up, Mrs. Vance." That night, just after midnight, the explosion ripped through the quiet town. It came from the direction of the railroad depot, what was left of it after the earlier sabotage. Fire lit up the sky, and shouts of alarm filled the air. The deputy, a young man named Peters who'd been dozing at his desk, bolted awake. He looked toward the cells, then toward the door, clearly torn between his duty and the instinct to see what was happening. "Go on," Samuel called out. "We're locked up, Peters. Not like we're going anywhere, but that fire looks serious. Probably need all hands to fight it." Peters hesitated another moment, then grabbed his hat and ran out the door, leaving it open behind him. "Now," Elias hissed. From beneath his bunk, where he'd carefully hidden it during Rebecca's visit, Caleb pulled out the small hacksaw blade his mother had smuggled in, concealed in the lining of her skirt. It was crude and small, but it was something. "This is going to take forever," Thomas said, watching Caleb work on the lock mechanism. "Then maybe we'll get some help," Samuel said, and nodded toward the door. Rebecca stepped into the jail, carrying Samuel's rifle and wearing a look of fierce determination that made her seem 10 feet tall. Behind her, impossibly, came Cole Hastings and 3 of his men. "Thought you'd run," Elias said. "I did," Cole replied, already working on the locks with proper tools. "Got about 10 miles before I realized I was abandoning good men to hang for doing what was right. Came back, linked up with Mrs. Vance, and here we are." "The explosion?" Caleb asked. "Dynamite," one of Cole's men said with a grin. "Figured the railroad owed us a few more delays. Should keep the whole town busy for at least an hour." The locks gave way, and the 4 prisoners stumbled out of their cells, free but now officially fugitives. Dalton would return soon, would discover the escape, and then every lawman in the territory would be hunting them. "There's horses waiting on the edge of town," Cole said. "We ride hard, and we can be in the hills by dawn. After that, you boys are going to need to disappear for a while." Samuel looked at his wife, and something passed between them that didn't need words. This was goodbye, possibly forever. If they were caught, the charge would be escaping custody. They'd hang for sure. And if they ran, Rebecca and Mary would be left to face the railroad's vengeance alone. "Come with us," Samuel said. "You and Mary. We'll go south, maybe Mexico. Start over somewhere the railroad can't reach." Rebecca shook her head, tears streaming down her face, but her voice steady. "Someone has to stay and maintain the property claim, and Mary's too young for life on the run. We'll be fine. You just stay alive, Samuel Vance. Stay alive and stay free, and someday, when this is over, you find your way home." They embraced, a lifetime of love and partnership compressed into seconds. Then Rebecca turned to Caleb and Elias, hugging them both. "Be smart," she whispered. "Be careful. And remember who you are." There was no more time. Already they could hear shouts as the fire was brought under control, as someone discovered the jail door open. They grabbed weapons and supplies that Cole had brought and slipped out the back of the jail into the darkness. By the time Dalton returned and raised the alarm, the Vance men and their allies were 3 miles gone, pushing their horses hard toward the hills and the vast wilderness beyond. Behind them, redemption erupted in chaos. Ahead lay the life of fugitives, hunted, desperate, and forever changed. Caleb looked back once as they rode, seeing the lights of the town receding. Somewhere back there was his mother, his sister, the farm that had been his whole world. He'd thought they were fighting to protect that world, to preserve their way of life. Instead, they'd lost it all. The railroad had won, just like Thornton Webb had promised. They'd taken everything, the land, the law, the life the Vances had built. All that remained was the running, the hiding, and the cold certainty that this was just the beginning. The outlaw life had claimed them, whether they'd chosen it or not. And Caleb, racing through the darkness with his brother and father beside him, felt something inside himself finally break loose completely. That last connection to the boy he'd been, the one who believed in fairness and justice and the fundamental decency of people. That boy was gone, burned away like the Pruitt farmhouse, like every innocent thing the railroad had touched. In his place was something harder, colder, and infinitely more dangerous. The continental Pacific had created its own enemy. Now they'd learn what that enemy could do. The hills became their home, though home was a word that had lost all meaning. For 3 months, the Vance brothers and their small band moved like ghosts through the territories, never staying in one place longer than a few days, always watching the horizon for dust clouds that meant pursuit. Cole Hastings had split off after the first week, taking his men south toward Texas. "You boys have too much heat on you," he'd said, gripping Samuel's hand in farewell. "The railroads put serious money on your heads. Every bounty hunter and desperate fool between here and California will be looking for you." He'd been right. The bounties had climbed to $1,000 each for Samuel, Elias, and Caleb. Thomas Pruitt was worth $500. The wanted posters called them murderers, insurgents, enemies of progress. Somewhere in the transformation from farmers to fugitives, they'd become legends, dangerous, ruthless outlaws who'd killed a dozen railroad men and escaped from custody in a daring raid. The truth was both simpler and more complicated. They were 4 desperate men trying to survive, making increasingly desperate choices to stay alive. The first robbery happened almost by accident. They'd been camped in a box canyon 20 miles from nowhere, supplies running low, when Thomas spotted a Continental Pacific supply wagon rolling along the valley road below. 6 horses pulling a heavily loaded freight wagon, 2 guards riding alongside. "That wagon's probably carrying payroll," Thomas had said, watching through Elias's field glasses. "The railroad moves cash every 2 weeks to pay their construction crews." "So?" Samuel said, but there was something in his voice. Not quite interest, but not quite dismissal either. "So we're broke," Caleb said bluntly. "We've got maybe 3 days of food left, our clothes are falling apart and winter's coming. That wagon's carrying Continental Pacific money they stole from farmers they terrorized and murdered." "It's also theft," Samuel said, but the conviction that had once been in his voice was gone, worn away by months of running and hiding. "It's justice," Thomas corrected. "They took everything from us, from all those families. I say we take something back." The debate lasted an hour, but the conclusion was inevitable. Morality was a luxury they could no longer afford. They needed supplies, needed money, needed something to show for the months of being hunted like animals. They hit the wagon at a narrow pass where the road curved between rock faces. It was textbook, something Samuel had learned in the war, tactics that felt disturbingly natural despite the years. 2 men above with rifles to pin down the guards, 2 below to take the wagon. The guards, surprised and outgunned, surrendered without firing a shot. The wagon contained exactly what Thomas had guessed, a payroll shipment of nearly $3,000, along with supplies and equipment. "Take the money," Elias ordered the guards after they'd tied them up. "Tell Thornton Webb this is just the beginning. Every dollar the Continental Pacific steals from honest families will steal back, with interest." They'd left the guards unharmed, taken the cash and supplies, and disappeared into the hills. Behind them, the legend grew a little larger. The Vance Gang, people started calling them. Robin Hood outlaws who robbed from the railroad and gave to, well, mostly they gave to themselves because survival required resources. But the story that spread through the territories was more romantic, righteous bandits striking back at corporate tyranny. The reality was grimmer and more exhausting than any legend suggested. Winter came hard that year, driving them further south and into increasingly desperate situations. They hit 2 more railroad shipments, a stagecoach carrying Continental Pacific executives, and a company store in a railroad town that was gouging workers with inflated prices. Each robbery was successful, each escape narrowly managed, and with each one, Caleb felt himself becoming someone he barely recognized. The cold thing inside him had grown until it filled almost everything. He could plan a robbery with the same practical focus he'd once applied to planning crops. He could hold a gun on terrified railroad employees without feeling anything except mild impatience when they moved too slowly. The boy who'd believed in fairness and law seemed like something from another lifetime, something that had happened to someone else. His father saw it. On a freezing night in late January, camped in a cave while snow fell outside, Samuel pulled Caleb aside. "You're changing," Samuel said quietly, so Elias and Thomas wouldn't hear, "hardening into something I don't recognize." "Good," Caleb said. "The soft version of me would be dead by now." "Maybe, but is this version alive in any way that matters?" Samuel's face was haggard, aged beyond his years. The outlaw life had broken something fundamental in him, some core belief about who he was and what he stood for. "We started this fighting for what was right. Now, we're just fighting. There's a difference." "Is there?" Caleb met his father's eyes. "We're still hitting the railroad, still making them pay. That was always the goal." "The goal was to protect our family and our land. We've lost both. What exactly are we accomplishing out here besides revenge?" Caleb had no answer to that. The truth was, revenge had become its own justification. Every robbery that hurt the Continental Pacific's bottom line felt like a small victory, even as it drove them deeper into a life they'd never wanted. The turning point came in March, when they learned that Thornton Webb had moved against Rebecca and Mary. The news came from a drifter they'd encountered in a nameless settlement near the Oklahoma border. The man recognized them. Hard not to, given the wanted posters, but instead of running for the law, he'd approached their camp cautiously. "You're the Vance brothers," he said, hands raised to show he meant no threat. "I got news from Kansas you'll want to hear. About your ma and sister." Caleb's heart had clenched. "What about them?" "The railroad took the farm 3 weeks back, used the eminent domain angle, had a judge sign off on it. Your ma tried to fight it, but they sent men with guns and eviction papers. She and the girl are living in Redemption now, in a boarding house, working for wages to survive." Samuel closed his eyes, pain etched deep in his face. "Are they hurt?" "Not physically, but word is Webb's been making their lives difficult, pressuring the boarding house owner, making sure nobody will hire them for decent work, letting everyone know what happens to families of outlaws." "That son of a bitch," Elias breathed. The drifter continued. "There's more. The territorial governors authorized the railroad to hire a private security force, basically mercenaries with legal sanction. They're hunting you boys specifically, $5,000 for the lot of you, dead or alive. And they've made it clear that dead is preferred." After the drifter left, the 4 men sat in silence. Everything they'd fought to protect was gone. The farm, the life, the hope that someday this would end and they could return home. Webb had taken it all while they'd been running and robbing and pretending that revenge was the same thing as justice. "We have to end this," Samuel said finally. "I can't do this anymore. Can't live like this. Can't watch from a distance while my wife and daughter suffer because of choices I made." "What are you suggesting?" Thomas asked. Samuel was quiet for a long moment. "There's been talk. The railroad's under pressure from investors about security costs. All the robberies, the delays, the bad publicity. It's hurting their stock value. I've heard rumors they might be willing to negotiate, reduce sentences in exchange for surrender and testimony about the intimidation tactics they used." "You trust them to honor a deal?" Caleb asked incredulously. "After everything they've done?" "I don't know," Samuel admitted, "but I know I can't keep living like this. And I can't keep letting Rebecca and Mary pay for my pride." "It's not pride, Pa. It's survival." "Is it?" Samuel looked at his sons. "What are we surviving for? To keep running until we're dead or in prison anyway? At least if we negotiate a surrender, there's a chance we might get out someday. Might have a life again." The argument raged for days. Thomas was adamantly against it. Surrender meant trusting the same system that had murdered his family. Elias was torn, understanding both his father's exhaustion and the impossibility of trusting their enemies. Caleb fought it with every fiber of his being, convinced that surrender was just another word for execution. But Samuel's will was eroding, worn down by months of fear and flight, and the knowledge that his family was suffering while he hid in the hills like a coward. "I'm done," Samuel finally said. "I'm going to reach out through intermediaries, see if the railroad will negotiate. You boys can make your own choice, but I'm not living like this anymore." It took 3 weeks to arrange. Messages passed through sympathetic townspeople, coded letters, careful meetings with lawyers who claimed to represent interests wanting to de-escalate the conflict. The railroad, it seemed, really was willing to talk. The violence was costing them too much money and generating too much negative attention. If the Vance gang would surrender and testify about the murders and intimidation, reduced sentences could be arranged. 7 years instead of hanging, time in territorial prison, but time that would eventually end. "It's a trap," Caleb insisted. "They'll take us into custody and hang us before any trial happens." "Maybe," Samuel said, "but maybe not. And I'd rather take that chance than keep running. I want to see your mother again, Caleb. I want to see Mary. Even if it's through prison bars, I want to see them." The surrender was arranged for April 15th in a small town called Walker's Crossing, neutral territory with a federal marshal overseeing the process to ensure fairness. Samuel would go in first, with a lawyer present and witnesses to document the terms. If the railroad honored their agreement, the others would follow. Caleb fought his father every step of the way, but in the end, Samuel made his choice. He was tired of running, tired of the man he'd become, tired of a war that had no end and no victory possible. "If this goes wrong," Samuel told his sons the night before, "you run. Don't try to rescue me. Don't try to get revenge. Just run and build a life somewhere they can't find you. Promise me." Neither Caleb nor Elias promised anything. They rode into Walker's Crossing at dawn, a town of maybe 200 souls that seemed caught between frontier roughness and civilized aspiration. The federal marshal, a man named Clayton Reeves, met them on the main street with official documentation and a surprisingly sympathetic demeanor. "Mr. Vance," Reeves said, shaking Samuel's hand, "I've reviewed the terms negotiated by your counsel. 7 years territorial prison, eligible for parole after 5 with good behavior. In exchange, full testimony regarding Continental Pacific Railroad, intimidation, and violence tactics. The territorial governor has signed off on this agreement personally. And my sons and Mr. Pruitt, same terms, provided their testimony corroborates yours." Reeves looked at Caleb, Elias, and Thomas. "Gentlemen, I know you have every reason to distrust this process, but I give you my word as a federal marshal that this surrender will be conducted legally and honorably. You'll be transported to Yuma Territorial Prison, where you'll serve your time under federal jurisdiction, not railroad influence." It sounded too good to be true. Caleb's instincts screamed trap, but his father's face showed something that had been absent for months: hope. They surrendered their weapons, were placed in irons, not cruelly, but firmly. The documentation was signed, witnessed by the town's mayor and 3 prominent citizens. Everything was done by the book, legally impeccable. For 6 hours, it seemed like maybe, impossibly, this might actually work. Then Thornton Webb arrived with 20 hired guns and a forged warrant from a corrupt territorial judge superseding the federal agreement. Marshal Reeves tried to stop it, arguing law and jurisdiction and federal authority, but Webb had anticipated every objection. The warrant claimed new evidence of additional murders, claimed federal authority was void in the face of territorial law, claimed a dozen legal technicalities that meant exactly nothing, except that power and money trumped justice again. "You didn't actually think we'd let you testify, did you?" Webb said, standing in front of Samuel's cell with a smile that didn't reach his cold eyes. "Tell the world about our business practices? Destroy our reputation? The agreement your lawyer negotiated was never going to be honored. It was just bait to get you to surrender." "The federal marshal," Samuel started, "has no jurisdiction here. This is territorial matter now, and the territorial authorities answer to me." Webb leaned closer to the bars. "You're going to hang, Vance. All of you. Tomorrow morning, public execution, and every newspaper in the territory will report how the dangerous Vance gang was finally brought to justice. The railroad wins, you lose, just like I always told you it would end." That night, locked in cells that were far more secure than Redemption's jail had been, the 4 men faced the reality of their situation. They'd been outmaneuvered, outplayed, betrayed by a system that had never intended to honor any agreement. "I'm sorry," Samuel said, his voice hollow. "I led us into this. My pride, my hope that the system might still work if we gave it a chance. I should have listened to you, Caleb." "Doesn't matter now," Caleb said, though rage and something like grief churned in his gut. They'd almost had a way out, almost had a chance at a future, even if it was measured in prison years. And the railroad had ripped even that away. "There's got to be a way out," Thomas said desperately. "We escaped Redemption. We can escape this." But Walker's Crossing wasn't Redemption. The jail was solid stone, the bars were thick iron, and there were guards, real guards, not half-drunk deputies, stationed both inside and outside. 4 men were scheduled to hang at dawn, and the town had turned the impending execution into an event. People were already arriving, setting up for the spectacle. Caleb lay on the hard bunk and stared at the ceiling, feeling something break loose inside him. Not the cold thing, that had been there for months. Something else. Some last connection to the idea that the world operated on principles beyond raw power and violence. His father had tried to do the right thing, had tried to navigate the system legally and honorably, and it had led them straight to the gallows. There was a lesson in that, Caleb thought bitterly. The law didn't protect the weak or punish the powerful. It was just another weapon the strong used against those who had nothing. Outside, night deepened toward dawn. Somewhere in that darkness, their execution platform was being prepared, the ropes tested, the trapdoor mechanism checked. By noon tomorrow, the Vance gang would be history, a cautionary tale about what happened to those who resisted progress. Caleb closed his eyes and tried to make peace with dying, tried to think of his mother and sister, hoped they'd be all right after this was over, hoped the railroad would leave them alone once the men of the family were dead. He was so deep in these dark thoughts that he almost missed the sound. A soft scraping, barely audible, coming from the alley behind the jail. Then a whisper through the tiny barred window high on the wall. "Little brother, you alive in there?" Caleb's eyes snapped open. That voice was impossible. Elias was in the next cell, his father and Thomas in the cells beyond. That voice should not exist. But it did. "Cole?" Caleb whispered back, standing on his bunk to reach the window. "That you?" Who else would be dumb enough to break into a jail the night before an execution? Cole Hastings' face appeared briefly in the window gap, grinning like a madman. "We heard what happened. Figured you boys might need some help. We're locked in stone cells with guards everywhere. There's no way." "There's always a way, Caleb. You taught me that." Cole's face disappeared, replaced by the business end of a rifle barrel. "Get down and cover your heads. This is going to be loud." 3 explosions, carefully placed and perfectly timed, blew open the back wall of the jail in a cascade of stone and dust. Alarms rang. Guards shouted. Gunfire erupted. And through the smoke and chaos, Cole Hastings and 8 heavily armed men stormed into the cells. "Evening, gentlemen," Cole said, already working on the locks with lockpicks in raw force. Hate to interrupt your evening, but you've got an appointment with some rope tomorrow, and I'm of a mind to cancel it." The locks gave way. The four condemned men stumbled out of their cells, coughing from the dust, disbelieving their own rescue. "How did you—" Samuel started. "Explanations later. Running now." Cole thrust rifles into their hands. "We've got horses in the alley, and about 30 seconds before every gun in town converges on this building. Move!" They moved, through the destroyed wall, into the alley where horses waited, mounted and riding hard before most of the town even understood what had happened. Behind them, chaos reigned, guards shooting at shadows, citizens panicking, the whole carefully planned execution dissolving into disaster. They rode through the night, changing horses twice, pushing the animals to their limits and beyond. Dawn found them 20 miles away, hidden in a canyon system that Cole knew like his own hand. "How?" Elias finally asked, when they'd stopped to rest and water the horses. "You were in Texas. How did you even know?" "Word travels," Cole said. "Heard you boys were surrendering, heard it was going to be a trap. Gathered some men who still remember what the railroad did to their families, and we came north. Figured if the Vance gang could take on the Continental Pacific, least we could do was make sure they didn't hang for it." Samuel clasped Cole's shoulder, too overcome with emotion to speak. Caleb felt something crack inside him, not breaking, but shifting. They'd been betrayed by the system, had walked straight into a trap trusting that law and honor meant something. But they'd been saved by loyalty, by men who remembered their cause and refused to let them die forgotten. "They'll never stop hunting us now," Thomas said. "We were escaping custody before. Now we're escaping an execution. They'll bring in the army if they have to." "Probably," Cole agreed. "You boys are officially the most wanted men in the territory. Bounties will go up, hunters will come from everywhere, and you'll never have a moment's peace as long as you're in Kansas or anywhere the railroad has influence." "Then we leave," Caleb said. The decision formed as he spoke it, feeling inevitable and right. "Mexico, maybe. Somewhere the continental Pacific's reach doesn't extend." "Caleb," his father started. "No, Pa. Cole's right. We can't stay here. Every day we remain in the territories, we risk Rebecca and Mary. The railroad will use them to draw us out, and we'll end up dead or hanged. Only way to protect them is to disappear completely. Let the railroad think we're gone forever." The words hurt to say, but Caleb knew they were true. The life they'd known was over. The war with the railroad couldn't be won. They'd tried legal means, tried violence, tried surrender, and every path had led to disaster. All that remained was survival, and survival meant running far enough that the continental Pacific's influence couldn't reach. Samuel looked older than the frontier itself, beaten down by the weight of choices and consequences. "Your mother will understand," Elias finished. "She told us to stay alive, Pa. That's what we're doing." They rested for 2 days in that canyon while Cole sent scouts to gather information. The news was exactly as bad as expected. The territory was flooding with bounty hunters. The railroad had tripled the reward, $15,000 for the Vance gang, dead or alive. Marshal Reeves had been dismissed from federal service for his role in the botched surrender. Thornton Webb was giving interviews to every newspaper, promising that justice would be served. "You boys are famous," Cole said, reading from a Kansas City paper. "The Vance gang, outlaws or freedom fighters. There's a whole editorial debate about whether you're criminals or folk heroes standing up to corporate tyranny." "What's the consensus?" Thomas asked bitterly. "Depends who you ask. Railroad towns think you're murdering outlaws. Farming communities think you're heroes. Everyone agrees you're dangerous as hell and probably going to end up dead." Cole set the paper down. "For what it's worth, I think you did what you had to do. Nobody should fault a man for fighting back when the system fails him. But fault or no fault, the reality remained. They were hunted men with no safe harbor, no future except running until they couldn't run anymore." The group split up 3 days later. Cole and his men headed back to Texas, their own futures uncertain but at least less immediately deadly than the Vance brothers. Samuel, Elias, Caleb, and Thomas turned south toward Mexico and whatever life waited beyond the border. Before they parted, Cole pulled Caleb aside. "You've changed since the first time we met. Harder, colder. That coldness will keep you alive. but don't let it kill the man you were." "That man's already dead," Caleb said. "He died the day the railroad burned the Pruitts alive, and nobody faced consequences for it." "Maybe, but Rebecca Vance raised sons who believed in something beyond survival. Try to remember that wherever you end up. Because if you lose that completely, the railroad wins even if you're still breathing." They parted with handshakes and unspoken acknowledgement that they'd probably never see each other again. Then the Vance brothers and Thomas Pruitt rode south toward an uncertain future in a foreign land, leaving behind everything they'd known and everyone they'd loved. Caleb looked back once, seeing the territories spread out behind them like a promise that had failed. Somewhere back there was his mother, his sister, the graves of people they'd tried and failed to protect. Somewhere back there was the boy he'd been, buried under months of violence and betrayal and hard choices. They crossed the border into Mexico 3 weeks later, wanted men leaving behind their crimes and their causes, seeking nothing more than to be forgotten by the forces that had destroyed their lives. The Continental Pacific Railroad would continue its westward expansion. Thornton Webb would grow rich and powerful, and the Vance gang would fade into legend. Outlaws who'd fought the railroad and lost, romanticized by some, reviled by others, but ultimately just 4 desperate men who'd chosen survival over principle and found that survival had its own terrible cost. Caleb Vance, now 23 years old and harder than the iron rails that had destroyed his family, rode into Mexico and tried to believe that somewhere ahead lay the possibility of peace. But peace, he was learning, was something other men enjoyed. For those who'd crossed the lines he'd crossed, made the choices he'd made, there was only the running, the hiding, and the cold certainty that the past was never really past. It followed you, patient and inevitable as death itself. Mexico offered refuge, but not peace. The 4 men settled in a small pueblo called San Rafael, 30 miles south of the border, where American law held no sway and questions about a man's past were considered impolite. For 3 months, they lived quietly, working odd jobs, learning Spanish, trying to convince themselves that the running was over. Samuel aged rapidly in those months, the weight of exile crushing something vital inside him. He'd talk about Rebecca and Mary constantly, wondering how they were surviving, whether they thought of him, whether they'd ever forgive the choices that had led to this permanent separation. Elias tried to hold the group together, but even his strength was finite. Thomas Pruitt drank heavily, drowning memories of his family in cheap tequila and bitter silence, and Caleb grew restless in ways that frightened him. The quiet life felt wrong, like a coat that didn't fit. He'd catch himself scanning the horizon for threats that didn't exist, his hand drifting to a gun that wasn't there. The cold thing inside him had no use for peace. It needed purpose, needed the sharp edge of danger to feel truly alive. "You're thinking about going back?" Elias said one evening, finding Caleb staring north toward the border. "Maybe." "For what? To get killed? We barely escaped with our lives, little brother. Whatever's back there, it's not worth dying for." "Maybe dying's not the worst thing," Caleb said quietly. "At least it would be an ending. This..." He gestured at the pueblo, at their exile, at the slow dissolution of everything they'd been. "This isn't living, it's just not dying. That's the outlaw in you talking, the part that got addicted to the danger." Elias gripped his shoulder. "You need to let that part go before it kills you." But Caleb couldn't let it go, because that part had become who he was. The farmer's son was gone, replaced by something harder and more dangerous, something that didn't know how to exist without a war to fight. The decision to return north came in June, triggered by a letter that reached them through a network of sympathizers who still tracked the Vance gang's legend. The letter was from Rebecca, smuggled across the border by Cole Hastings' people, and it changed everything. Samuel read it aloud to the group, his voice breaking on almost every word. Rebecca wrote of struggles and small victories, of Mary growing up too fast in a world that judged her for her family name. She wrote of missing Samuel with an ache that never dulled. But most importantly, she wrote of rumors spreading through Kansas that the Continental Pacific Railroad was facing serious legal troubles. Investors were questioning the violence that had plagued their expansion. Federal authorities were investigating claims of corruption. Thornton Webb himself had been called to testify before a territorial commission. The tide might be turning, Rebecca had written. People are starting to question the railroad's methods. Your story, what really happened, it's gaining traction. There's talk of amnesty for those who were driven to desperation by corporate violence. I don't know if it's real or just hopeful thinking, but Samuel, maybe there's a path home for you, for all of you. Hope was a dangerous thing for desperate men. It made them reckless, made them believe in possibilities that rational thought would dismiss. But after months of exile and emptiness, hope was irresistible. I'm going back, Samuel said simply. Even if it's a trap, even if it ends badly, I need to see your mother again. I need to see Mary. I can't die in a foreign land, buried where they'll never know what happened to me. Pa, this could be the railroad's way of drawing us out, Elias warned. I know, but I don't care anymore. Samuel met his son's eyes. I'm not asking you to come with me. You boys have your whole lives ahead of you. You could build something here in Mexico, where the past doesn't define you. But me? I'm 53 years old, and I've spent the last year running from everything that mattered. I'd rather die trying to get home than live another day in exile. Thomas Pruitt stood up, swaying slightly from the tequila, but his voice steady. I'll go with you. I've got scores to settle, and I'm done hiding. Elias looked at Caleb, a long conversation happening in that glance. They both knew their father was probably riding to his death. They both knew that going back meant risking everything they'd survived. But they also knew they couldn't let him go alone. We ride together, Elias said. Same as always. They crossed back into American territory in early July, moving cautiously, staying to back roads and avoiding towns where their faces might be recognized. The wanted posters were still up. They saw one in a border settlement, their likenesses rendered in crude but effective detail. $15,000, dead or alive. The price had even increased. We're worth more dead than we ever were alive, Caleb observed darkly. They headed north toward Kansas, traveling mostly at night, stealing what they needed when they had no choice. The country had changed in their absence, or maybe they'd changed and saw it differently now. The railroad expansion had continued, iron veins spreading across the frontier, bringing prosperity to some towns and destroying others. Progress, they called it, though Caleb saw only conquest dressed in civilized language. 2 weeks into their journey, they encountered the first sign that Rebecca's letter might contain truth. In a settlement called Broken Creek, they overheard a conversation in a saloon, two men discussing the continental Pacific's troubles. A federal investigation had uncovered evidence of systematic bribery, intimidation, and violence. Several railroad executives had been indicted. Thornton Webb was fighting the charges, but his reputation was damaged beyond repair. Public opinion's turned against them, one man said. All those stories about farmers being terrorized, families murdered, people finally believe it. Railroad claimed it was all lies spread by outlaws, but too many witnesses came forward. Even found mass graves near some of the construction sites. Workers who complained about conditions mysteriously disappeared. What about the Vance gang? The other man asked. Still got bounties on them, don't they? Yeah, but there's talk. Some congressmen are pushing for amnesty, saying those boys were driven to desperation by corporate violence. Might be political theater, might be real. Hard to say. Caleb and Elias exchanged glances. Maybe Rebecca's hope wasn't entirely unfounded. Maybe the world really had shifted enough that the truth might matter again. They pushed on toward Kansas, caution warring with growing hope. Samuel seemed transformed, years falling away as he got closer to home. He talked constantly about what he'd say to Rebecca, how he'd explain the choices he'd made, whether Mary would even recognize him. They were 50 miles from Redemption when they encountered her. Lena Hale was traveling alone on a road no woman should travel without protection, driving a wagon loaded with supplies toward a farm community that had been hit hard by drought. She was 24 years old, with dark hair and eyes that had seen hardship, but hadn't surrendered to it. When the Vance brothers and Thomas stopped her on the road, not to rob her, just to ask about local conditions, she'd looked at them without fear. I know who you are, she'd said calmly. The Vance gang. Your faces are on posters in every town between here and Oklahoma. Caleb's hand had gone to his gun, but Lena just laughed. Relax, I'm not turning you in. Half the farmers in this territory consider you heroes. The other half are too scared of the railroad to say what they really think. She'd studied them with sharp intelligence. You're heading toward Redemption? Maybe, Samuel said carefully. Why? Because the railroad still owns that town, and walking in there would be suicide. But if you're set on it, you should know things have changed. Webb's losing his grip, but he's dangerous because of it. Cornered animals bite hardest. She'd given them information about troop movements, about which routes were watched and which were clear. Before she'd driven on, she'd looked at Caleb and said something that had lodged in his chest like a splinter. "You've got the look," she'd said, "like you're already half dead inside. Whatever you're planning, make sure it's worth finishing the job." They'd encountered her again 3 days later in a small farming community where they'd stopped for supplies. Lena was delivering food to families struggling through the drought, organizing relief efforts, doing the kind of community work that kept people alive when larger systems failed them. "You're still here," she'd said, seeing Caleb in the general store. "Waiting for the right moment to move on redemption. Or waiting because you're afraid of what you'll find there." She'd said it kindly, not as an accusation. "Your mother and sister, they're doing okay. I know them. I've helped them when the railroad made things difficult." "You know my mother?" Everyone knows Rebecca Vance. She's become something of a symbol. The woman who refused to break even after losing everything. Some people resent her for it. Most admire her. Lena had looked at him with those sharp eyes. "She talks about you sometimes. About all of you. Wonders if you're alive, if you're safe. She'd want to know you made it to Mexico." Something in Caleb cracked open at that. For months, he'd tried not to think about his mother, about what she must be going through. Hearing that she still thought of them, still spoke of them with something other than shame, nearly undid him. "Why are you helping us?" he'd asked. "Because the railroad destroyed my family too. Different circumstances, same result. My father worked for Continental Pacific, spoke up about safety violations. They blacklisted him industry-wide. He died 3 years later, poor and broken." Lena's voice was steady, but her eyes were hard. "So when I see people who actually fought back, who made the railroad pay a price for what they've done, I don't turn them in, I help them." That conversation had led to others. Lena knew the territory, knew which families could be trusted and which were railroad informants. She helped them establish a safe house in a barn outside Redemption, brought them information about Webb's movements and the federal investigation's progress. And somewhere in those conversations, Caleb fell in love. It wasn't the romantic love of storybooks. It was something more fundamental, recognition of a kindred spirit, someone who understood loss and rage and the desperate need to make meaning from suffering. Lena saw the cold, hard thing he'd become and didn't flinch from it. She saw the violence in his past and judged it in context of the violence that had spawned it. "You're not a bad man," she told him one evening when they were alone in the barn, keeping watch while the others slept. "You're a man who was forced into impossible choices and did what he had to do to survive." "I've killed people," Caleb said bluntly. "Robbed, stolen, terrorized. How is that not bad?" "Context matters. The railroad killed innocent families. You killed the men who murdered them. One is evil, the other is justice, that the law refused to provide." She touched his face gently. "You're carrying so much anger, Caleb. It's going to burn you hollow if you don't find a way to let it go." "I don't know how to let it go." "Then maybe you need to finish what you started. Face Webb, face the railroad, and end this properly. Not with more violence, but with truth. The federal investigation needs witnesses. Your testimony could get us hanged," Caleb interrupted. "Pa tried the legal route once. It was a trap that nearly killed us all." "That was before. Things are different now. The investigation is real, federal, not territorial. Webb's power is breaking. You could be part of what finally brings him down." The idea was seductive, but terrifying. Trust the system one more time. Believe that law and justice might actually align. Caleb wanted to believe it. Wanted to believe that the cold, violent thing he'd become could be set aside for something better. Over the following weeks, as they planned their approach to redemption, Caleb spent every spare moment with Lena. She showed him that life could be more than survival and revenge. She talked about the future, the farm she wanted to start, the community she wanted to build, the possibility that the frontier could be tamed not through violence, but through cooperation and mutual aid. "Come with me when this is over," she said one night, lying beside him in the hayloft while stars wheeled overhead. Not Mexico, not running, just life. Simple, honest life. We could farm, raise children, build something that matters. You'd tie yourself to a wanted outlaw? Caleb asked, though his heart ached with the desire to believe in her vision. I'd tie myself to a good man who got dealt a terrible hand and played it the best he could. She'd kissed him then, and for the first time in 2 years, Caleb felt something warm displace the cold thing inside him. Say yes. Say you'll try to build a life instead of just running from death. Yes, he'd whispered. When this is over. Yes. But the outlaw life had other plans. The first crack appeared when Samuel insisted on making contact with Rebecca directly rather than through intermediaries. Against everyone's advice, he rode into redemption in disguise and met his wife at the boarding house where she worked. The reunion was tearful and desperate, two people who'd been torn apart trying to compress a year of separation into stolen minutes. But they were seen. Someone recognized Samuel despite his disguise, and word reached Thornton Webb within hours. The railroad man, fighting for his reputation and freedom as the federal investigation closed around him, saw an opportunity for redemption in his enemy's capture. He moved fast and hard. The boarding house was raided that same night. Samuel barely escaped, but Rebecca was arrested as an accomplice to a wanted fugitive. Mary, too. Webb announced publicly that the Vance women would be held as material witnesses and as leverage to draw out the outlaws. He's using them as bait, Elias said, reading the newspaper report. He knows we'll come for them. Of course we'll come for them, Caleb said. That's his plan. Draw us out, kill us in the street, claim self-defense, or resisting arrest. The federal investigation can't touch him if we're dead. Thomas Pruitt checked his guns methodically. Then we make sure he doesn't get the chance. We hit the jail, free Rebecca and Mary, and disappear before Webb knows what happened. Lena, hearing the plan, had grabbed Caleb's arm with fierce intensity. This is exactly what he wants. You walk into redemption and you're walking into an ambush. There are federal marshals in town now, investigating Webb. Work with them. Do this legally. Legal means trusting the same system that's failed us every single time, Caleb said, though he wanted desperately to believe her. Then trust me, Lena pleaded. I've made contact with Marshal Reeves, the same one from Walker's Crossing. He's part of the federal investigation now, and he's committed to taking Webb down. If you testify, if you provide evidence of what Webb did, you can free your mother and sister legally and end this. Reeves was powerless before, Samuel said. What's different now? Federal jurisdiction, congressional pressure. The railroad's lost its political protection. Webb's crimes are finally catching up to him. Lena looked at each of them in turn. Please, don't throw your lives away on a rescue mission that'll just give Webb what he wants. Do this the right way. The argument raged for hours. Thomas was adamantly against it. He'd lost faith in legal solutions when his family burned. Samuel was torn between his desire to protect his family and his exhaustion with violence. Elias tried to find middle ground that didn't exist. And Caleb, looking at Lena's desperate face, feeling the pull of two futures, one built on continued violence and running, the other on hope and trust and the possibility of peace, made a choice that would haunt him forever. We try it Lena's way, he said. We make contact with Reeves, offer testimony, do this legally. But if it goes wrong, if it's another trap, we fight our way out and never look back. They approached Marshal Reeves through Lena's intermediary, negotiating carefully, establishing terms. Reeves, to his credit, seemed genuinely committed to justice this time. He arranged a meeting in a secure location with federal protection and witnesses. Testify against Webb, provide details about the violence and intimidation, and I'll personally guarantee your safety, Reeves promised. Your mother and sister will be released immediately, charges dropped. And while the territorial warrants will still exist, the federal government will intervene on your behalf. You'll serve reduced time in federal custody, not territorial. It's the best deal you're going to get. It was better than they'd hoped for, and exactly what Lena had promised. Samuel wanted to accept immediately. Elias was cautiously optimistic. Thomas remained skeptical, but willing to try. Caleb felt the cold thing inside him screaming warnings, felt every instinct telling him this was another trap. But he looked at Lena, at the future she was offering, at the possibility of setting down the weight he'd been carrying for 2 years. We'll do it, he said, but on our terms. The testimony happens publicly, with newspaper reporters present, and our mother and sister are released before we say a single word. Non-negotiable. Reeves agreed. The testimony was scheduled for the following week in the Redemption Courthouse, with federal oversight and press coverage. Everything was arranged, documented, legally sound. For 6 days, it looked like maybe, impossibly, this might actually work. Rebecca and Mary were released into protective custody. The federal investigation produced more evidence of Webb's crimes daily. Public opinion had turned completely against the railroad. This time, the system seemed to be working. Caleb spent those 6 days with Lena, planning the life they'd build when this was over. She talked about the farm she'd inherit from her uncle, about the work they'd do together, about children and harvest seasons and growing old watching sunsets from their porch. It was a beautiful dream, and for the first time since his family's farm had been threatened, Caleb let himself believe in it. "I love you," he told her the night before the testimony, the words feeling both foreign and essential. "Whatever happens tomorrow, I need you to know that. You made me believe in something beyond survival." "Nothing's going to happen," Lena said, but there was worry in her eyes. "Tomorrow you testify, Webb goes to prison, and we start our life. Simple as that." But nothing about the Vance brothers' story had ever been simple. They were preparing to leave for the courthouse the next morning when shots rang out from the perimeter of their safe house. Thomas Pruitt took a bullet through the window, dropping with a scream of pain. Outside, they could hear horses shouting, the sounds of an organized assault. "Ambush!" Elias yelled, grabbing his rifle. "Webb's men! They found us!" The attack was coordinated and brutal. 20 men surrounded the barn, pouring gunfire through every opening. The federal marshals who were supposed to be protecting them were nowhere to be seen, either killed or bought off, or simply not there because this had been a trap from the beginning. Caleb dragged Thomas away from the window, seeing blood spreading across his friend's shirt. "How bad?" "Bad enough," Thomas gasped. "Should have known better than to trust them." They fought back with desperate fury, but they were outgunned and surrounded. Samuel took a bullet through the shoulder. Elias's rifle was shot from his hands. The barn was splintering under the gunfire, offering less cover with each passing second. Through the chaos, Caleb saw Thornton Webb himself directing the assault from horseback, his face lit with savage triumph. This was his answer to the federal investigation, his solution to the threat of testimony. Kill the witnesses, claim self-defense, and let the court sort it out later when the only people left alive to tell the story were his own men. "We have to run," Elias shouted. "Back door, now, while we still can." But running meant leaving Thomas, who couldn't walk. Running meant abandoning the hope of testimony and justice. Running meant proving Webb right, that they were nothing but outlaws, criminals fleeing the law. Caleb made his choice in a heartbeat. He grabbed Thomas, ignoring the bigger man's protests, and hauled him toward the back of the barn. Samuel and Elias provided covering fire while they crashed through the rear door into the pre-dawn darkness. They ran, stumbling and bleeding, with the sounds of pursuit close behind. Thomas passed out from blood loss, forcing Caleb to carry him in a fireman's hold that tore at his muscles. His father was struggling to keep pace, his shoulder wound bleeding heavily. Only Elias seemed relatively unscathed, but his face was set in lines of fury and betrayal. They made it to the horses Lena had hidden a mile away, contingency planning that now felt prescient rather than paranoid. Caleb set Thomas across a saddle and was about to mount when he realized someone was missing. "Where's Lena?" he asked, panic surging through his exhaustion. "She wasn't at the barn," Elias said. "She was supposed to meet us there at dawn, remember? She's probably safe in town, doesn't even know what happened yet." But Caleb couldn't shake the feeling of wrongness, the sense that he'd just lost something irreplaceable. He wanted to go back, wanted to find her, but Samuel was barely conscious and Thomas was dying, and every second they stayed was a second closer to capture. "We have to move," Elias insisted. "Now, Caleb, we're out of time." They rode hard into the sunrise, leaving behind redemption and justice and any hope of the life Lena had promised. Behind them, Thornton Webb would spin his story. Outlaws ambushed federal marshals, killed in the ensuing gunfight. Bodies burned beyond recognition in the barn fire. The federal investigation would lose its star witnesses. The railroad would win again. Thomas Pruitt died 2 hours later, bleeding out in Caleb's arms with his final words, a curse against the system that had killed his family and never delivered justice. They buried him in a shallow grave in the wilderness, marked only by a pile of rocks and the memory of a young man who deserved better. Samuel's wound festered, and for days he drifted in and out of consciousness with fever. Elias and Caleb took turns caring for him, moving constantly, staying ahead of the pursuit they knew was coming. "Rebecca," Samuel mumbled in his delirium. "Have to get back to Rebecca." "We will, Pa," Caleb lied, knowing they'd never get back, knowing the life they'd tried to build was ashes. "Just rest now." 3 weeks later, Samuel Vance died in a cave 50 miles from anywhere, his body broken by wounds and infection and the accumulated weight of a war he'd never wanted to fight. His last words were his wife's name and an apology Caleb knew would never reach her. They buried Samuel beside a creek that had no name, in country so remote that no one would ever find the grave. Elias spoke words over the body, but Caleb felt nothing except the cold thing inside him, now grown so large it filled everything. "It's just us now," Elias said as they rode away from their father's grave. "Everyone else is dead or lost. Ma and Mary are back in redemption, probably thinking we're dead too. What do we do now, little brother?" Caleb stared at the horizon with eyes that felt like someone else's. The man who'd loved Lena Hale, who'd dreamed of farms and children and peaceful sunsets, was gone. Burned away in that ambush, buried with Thomas Pruitt and Samuel Vance. What remained was the outlaw, the killer, the legend that the newspapers had created. The Vance gang was down to 2, but those 2 were harder and more dangerous than they'd ever been. "We finish it," Caleb said, his voice empty of everything except cold purpose. "Webb took everything from us. Our family, our home, our future. He gets to pay for that. Caleb, there's no winning this fight. We've tried everything. Legal means, violence, surrender, running. Nothing works. The railroad always wins. Then we make sure that when we lose, he loses too." Caleb looked at his brother, and Elias flinched from what he saw in those eyes. "One last job. We rob enough to hurt them bad, make them feel a fraction of what they've taken from us. And then we disappear for good, or we die trying. Either way, this ends." Elias started to argue, then stopped. Because they both knew the truth, they were already dead. They died in that ambush, died with Thomas and Samuel, died when Lena's dream burned in the gunfire. What remained were just ghosts going through the motions, playing out the final act of a tragedy that had been written the moment they'd chosen to fight back. The outlaw life had consumed them completely. And now, with nothing left to lose and no future to hope for, they'd see it through to whatever ending waited in the darkness ahead. The plan took shape over 6 weeks of careful observation and cold calculation. The Continental Pacific was moving its largest quarterly payroll shipment on September 15th, nearly $50,000 in gold and cash, traveling by armored train from Kansas City to the western construction camps. It would pass through a narrow canyon outside of Blackwater Station, where the tracks curved sharply and the terrain offered perfect cover for an ambush. Caleb and Elias watched the route for days, memorizing guard rotations and timing, studying the armored car's defenses. They were no longer the desperate farmers who'd stumbled into outlawry. 2 years of running and fighting had honed them into something far more dangerous, professional criminals who understood that successful robbery was less about courage and more about planning. "We'll need more men," Elias said, sketching the canyon layout in the dirt. "Just the 2 of us can't take an armored train. There'll be at least 8 guards, maybe more." "Then we find men." Caleb's voice was flat, emptied of everything except purpose. "We've got a reputation. Plenty of desperate fools will sign on for a share of $50,000. They recruited in the saloons and gambling halls where outlaws gathered, places where the law's reach was weak, and a man's past was his own business. Word spread that the Vance brothers were planning something big, and volunteers appeared. Some were genuine criminals, drawn by the promise of easy money. Others were men like they'd once been, farmers and workers who'd been crushed by the railroad and wanted revenge disguised as profit. By early September, they'd assembled a gang of 12. Most Caleb didn't trust further than he could throw them, but trust wasn't necessary for this kind of work. He just needed guns and bodies, men willing to risk death for a share of the largest payroll the railroad had ever moved. The night before the robbery, camped in the hills above the canyon, Elias pulled Caleb aside. His brother looked older than his 28 years, worn down by the life they'd lived and the choices they'd made. "This is it, isn't it?" Elias said quietly. "Our last job. Win or lose, this is where it ends." "Probably," Caleb agreed. "Even if we pull it off, even if we get away clean, the heat will be too intense to ever work again. We'll have to disappear completely. New names, new lives, somewhere the legend can't follow. And if we don't pull it off, then at least we made them pay. $50,000 might not equal what they took from us, but it's something. It's a statement that they didn't crush us completely." Elias was silent for a long moment, staring at the stars that seemed impossibly distant and cold. "You ever think about Ma? About Mary? What they'll think when they hear we died robbing a train?" "Better they think we're dead than know we're alive and never coming home," Caleb said, though the words tasted like ash. "Rebecca told us to stay alive, but she also told us to remember who we are. I don't know who I am anymore, Elias. The farm boy died a long time ago. All that's left is this. The outlaw." "The survivor," Caleb corrected. "Same difference, I guess." They sat in silence, two brothers who'd started this journey trying to protect their family and ended it as the very thing they'd once feared becoming. The transformation was complete, and there was no path back to innocence even if they'd wanted one. The train came through at noon the next day, right on schedule. Caleb and his gang had positioned themselves along both sides of the canyon, using the high ground and natural cover to create a killing field. The plan was simple. Blow the tracks ahead of the train, forcing it to stop in the canyon, then overwhelm the guards through superior numbers and positioning. Caleb watched through field glasses as the locomotive approached, black smoke trailing against the blue sky. Somewhere in that train was the Continental Pacific's money, the profits extracted from terrorized families and murdered resistors. Taking it wouldn't bring back the Pruitts or Samuel Vance or Thomas Pruitt, wouldn't undo the suffering or restore what had been stolen, but it would hurt them, and hurting them was all Caleb had left. "Now," he said quietly, and the dynamite charge buried in the tracks detonated. The explosion was perfectly placed, destroying a section of rail and sending debris spiraling into the air. The locomotive's engineer saw it too late, locked the brakes, and the train screamed to a halt in a shriek of tortured metal, the armored car stopping exactly where Caleb had calculated it would. "Go!" Elias shouted, and the gang opened fire. The initial volley caught the railroad guards completely off balance. Two went down immediately, shot from positions they couldn't see to return fire against. The others scrambled for cover, shooting blindly at the canyon walls where muzzle flashes gave away the outlaws' positions. It should have been a quick, clean operation. Overwhelm the guards, breach the armored car, take the money, and disappear. Caleb had planned for contingencies, had studied every possible complication, but he hadn't planned for betrayal from within. The man who called himself Jack Reese, one of the volunteers who'd seemed most eager to join the gang, suddenly turned his gun on the outlaw beside him and shot him in the back. Then he was shouting to the railroad guards, giving away positions, identifying which shooters were real threats. "Reese is a plant!" someone yelled. "He's working for the railroad!" Chaos erupted. The carefully planned ambush dissolved into a confused firefight, with enemies on all sides. Caleb saw 3 of his men go down in the first minute, cut down by guards who now knew exactly where to shoot. The element of surprise was gone, replaced by a desperate scramble for survival. "Fall back," Elias was shouting. "It's a trap! Everyone fall back!" But falling back meant abandoning the payroll, meant this entire operation had been for nothing. Caleb found himself frozen between retreat and pressing forward, his mind calculating odds that kept getting worse. Then he saw Jack Reese lining up a shot on Elias, his brother exposed and unaware of the danger. Caleb didn't think, just moved. He threw himself between them as Reese fired, feeling the bullet punch into his side like a fist made of fire. He hit the ground hard, his vision graying at the edges. Through the haze of pain, he saw Elias gun down Reese, saw the remaining outlaws scattering into the canyon, saw the railroad guards advancing with renewed confidence. "Caleb!" Elias was there, grabbing him, hauling him to his feet. "Can you ride?" "Don't know," Caleb gasped. His side was wet with blood, his legs barely holding him upright. "Elias, just go. Leave me." "Not happening." Elias half-carried, half-dragged him toward where they'd hidden the horses. Bullets whined past them, kicking up dirt and rock fragments. "We started this together. We end it together. They made it to the horses through sheer desperation and covering fire from the few outlaws who hadn't already fled or died. Elias got Caleb into the saddle, then mounted his own horse and grabbed the reins of his brother's. "Ride!" he shouted, and they were moving, thundering out of the canyon with the sounds of pursuit close behind. The next hours existed in a fog of pain and movement. Caleb drifted in and out of consciousness, clinging to his saddle through instinct more than will. Elias kept them moving, changing direction constantly, using every trick they'd learned in 2 years of running to shake the pursuit. By nightfall, they'd lost the immediate chase, but Caleb knew it was only temporary. The railroad would send trackers, would mobilize every resource to hunt them down. The botched robbery would make them the most wanted men in the territory, and the failure meant they didn't even have the money to disappear properly. They'd lost everything. Again. Elias found shelter in an abandoned mining shack buried in hills so remote they might as well have been another world. He got Caleb inside, built a fire, and examined the wound with hands that were steadier than they had any right to be. "Bullet went through," Elias said. "That's good. But you're losing a lot of blood, and I think it nicked something internal. You need a doctor." "No doctors," Caleb managed. "Any doctor we see will turn us in for the bounty. Then you might die." "Been dying for 2 years," Caleb said with a bitter laugh that turned into a cough. "Just taking my time about it." Elias dressed the wound as best he could with the limited supplies they had, then sat back against the wall, exhaustion and despair written in every line of his body. "It's over, isn't it? This whole thing, the fighting, the running, the hope that we'd somehow win in the end. It's all been for nothing." "Not nothing," Caleb said, though he wasn't sure he believed it. "We fought back. That's more than most people did. We made the railroad afraid, even if it was just for a while. And what did it cost us? Pa's dead. Thomas is dead. Ma and Mary think we're dead. You're bleeding out in a shack in the middle of nowhere, and I'm going to be hunted until the day they hang me." Elias's voice broke. "What was it all for, Caleb? What did we actually accomplish?" Caleb had no answer. The question had been haunting him since the ambush at the safe house, since Lena had vanished from his life, since everything good had been burned away, leaving only ash and regret. He'd thought he was fighting for justice, for family, for the principle that people shouldn't be victims of corporate violence without consequences. But maybe Thornton Webb had been right from the beginning. Maybe power did matter more than principle. Maybe the strong really did get to write the rules and crush anyone who objected. "I'm sorry," Caleb said quietly, "for all of it. If I just let Pa sell when they first asked, if I hadn't pushed for resistance, maybe he'd still be alive. Maybe we'd all be alive." "Don't," Elias said harshly. "Don't rewrite history to make this your fault. We all made choices. Pa chose to fight. Thomas chose revenge. I chose to stand with you. Those were our decisions, and second-guessing them now doesn't change anything." But Caleb couldn't help the spiraling thoughts, the endless what-ifs that tortured him in his lucid moments. If they'd sold early, taken the money, and moved. If they'd never hit that first supply depot. If they'd stayed in Mexico when they had the chance. 1,000 decision points where different choices might have led to different outcomes. He slept fitfully, fever setting in as infection began its work. In his delirium, he saw faces. His father's weathered smile, his mother's tears. Mary as a child playing in the wheat fields. He saw the Pruitts burning, saw Thomas dying with blood on his lips, saw Lena's face as she talked about the future they'd never have. "The farm," he mumbled. "Ma, I need to get back to the farm." "Easy, little brother," Elias's voice said from somewhere far away. "Just rest. Just rest." But there was no rest for men like them. Only the running and the hiding and eventually the reckoning. Caleb woke 2 days later to find his fever had broken and his wound had stopped bleeding, though he was weak as a newborn calf and could barely stand. Elias had kept watch the entire time, barely sleeping, listening for sounds of pursuit that had so far not materialized. "We need to move," Elias said when he saw Caleb was lucid. "I've been watching the valley. No one's found us yet, but they will. The railroad's got trackers combing this whole territory." "Where do we go?" Caleb asked. "Mexico's weeks away and I can't travel like this. Every town within 100 miles knows our faces." "There's one place," Elias said carefully. Lena's farm, the one she inherited from her uncle. It's remote, not on any main road. If she's still there, maybe she'd hide us. At least until you're strong enough to travel. The mention of Lena's name sent pain through Caleb that had nothing to do with his wound. She's probably dead. Webb's people probably killed her after the ambush. Or maybe she escaped same as we did. Maybe she's been waiting, hoping we'd come to her. Elias met his eyes. It's a risk, but everywhere's a risk at this point. At least at the farm, you'd have a chance to heal properly. They rode out the next morning, Caleb barely able to stay in the saddle, but grimly determined not to slow them down. The journey that should have taken 2 days stretched to 5 as they moved cautiously, avoiding roads and settlements, traveling mostly at night. Lena's farm sat in a shallow valley 20 miles from nowhere, a small homestead with a house, barn, and fields that had been left fallow. As they approached in the pre-dawn darkness, Caleb's heart hammered with hope and dread in equal measure. The house showed no lights, no signs of life. Could be abandoned, Elias said quietly. Could be empty. Or it could be a trap, Caleb thought. Webb could have men waiting, could be using Lena as bait the same way he'd used Rebecca and Mary. But they had no other options. Caleb was deteriorating fast, his wound reopening from the hard travel. Without proper care soon, he'd die of infection or blood loss. They approached on foot, weapons ready, expecting ambush at any moment. The house remained dark and silent. Elias kicked open the door, rifle up and ready to fire. The house was empty, but not abandoned. There were signs of recent habitation, dishes in the sink, a bed that had been slept in, clothes hanging to dry. Someone was living here, and based on the simple dress hanging on a peg by the door, that someone was likely Lena. She made it, Caleb breathed, relief flooding through him so intensely it made him dizzy. She's alive. They waited inside, Caleb collapsing into a chair while Elias kept watch through the windows. Dawn came, bright and clear, and with it the sound of a wagon approaching. Elias tensed, rifle ready, but Caleb recognized the rhythm of the horse's gait, the particular creak of that wagon's wheels. It's her, he said. Let me go out. Alone. Caleb, please. If this goes wrong, if she's brought the law, you can still escape. But I need to see her, need to know if she made it. Elias reluctantly nodded, taking position where he could cover the approach but remain hidden. Caleb stood swaying with the effort and walked out onto the porch into the morning light. Lena was climbing down from the wagon, her arms full of supplies from town, when she looked up and saw him. The bag of flowers she'd been holding dropped to the ground, bursting open in a white cloud. Caleb? Her voice was barely a whisper. You're alive? Barely, he admitted. Lena, I'm sorry for everything. For leaving you, for not finding you sooner, for... She was running then, closing the distance between them and throwing her arms around him with such force it nearly knocked him over. He gasped with pain but held her anyway, burying his face in her hair, feeling her tears on his neck. I thought you were dead, she sobbed. The newspapers said you died in the ambush. They said they found bodies in the barn, said the Vance gang was finished. I've been grieving you for months. Webb's men killed Thomas and Pa, Caleb said, his own tears coming now. But Elias and I got away. We've been running since then. Tried one last job and it went to hell. I'm shot, Lena. Dying probably, if I don't get help. She pulled back, seeing the blood on his shirt for the first time, her face going pale. Inside. Now. I've got medical supplies. I've been helping the community since the drought. I can treat this. Over the next hour, with Elias standing guard and Caleb gritting his teeth against pain, Lena cleaned and dressed his wound properly. The bullet had indeed nicked something internal, but the damage wasn't as catastrophic as it might have been. With rest and care, she said, he might survive. The railroad thinks you're dead, she told them while she worked. They announced it publicly after the train robbery failed. Said the Vance brothers died in the canyon, their bodies burned beyond recognition in the chaos. There's no more bounty, no more manhunt. As far as the world knows, your story ended in that canyon. Then maybe it did, Caleb said quietly. Maybe this is our chance to disappear for real. New names, new lives. The legend dies and we just live. Lena looked at him with eyes that had seen too much suffering, too much loss. Can you do that? Can you set down the anger and the violence and just be Caleb again? Not the outlaw, not the legend, just a man. I don't know, Caleb admitted, but I want to try. I'm so tired, Lena. Tired of running, tired of fighting, tired of losing everyone I care about. If there's any chance at a normal life, even if it's built on lies and new identities, I want it. Then stay, she said simply. Both of you. You're dead to the world. Stay dead. Help me work this farm, build something real. Let the legend die in that canyon where it belongs. It was everything he'd dreamed of during those weeks before the ambush, the future she'd promised. And now, impossibly, it was being offered again. But there was one thing he had to do first, one last obligation to the life he was leaving behind. I need to see my mother, Caleb said, and Mary. Just once. Just to let them know I'm alive, that I made it. I can't disappear forever without them knowing. Lena's face tightened with worry. Caleb, that's incredibly dangerous. If anyone recognizes you, I know, but I can't live with myself if I don't. They've been grieving me for months. I have to let them know. He looked at Elias. You don't have to come. Stay here. Start building the life. But I need to do this. Elias sighed. We've made it this far together, little brother. I'm not stopping now. They waited 3 weeks while Caleb healed enough to travel. Lena prepared disguises, rough clothing, false beards, the kind of simple camouflage that wouldn't survive close inspection but might work from a distance. The plan was to approach Redemption at night, make contact with Rebecca somehow, have a brief reunion, then disappear forever. It was risky and probably stupid, but Caleb couldn't let go without it. His mother had lost her husband and sons to a war she'd never wanted. The least he could do was let her know that 2 of them had survived. They rode into Redemption's outskirts on a moonless night in late October. The town had changed in their absence. More buildings, more people. The railroad's influence evident in the prosperity that had come at such terrible cost. The Continental Pacific Depot dominated the center of town now, a monument to the power that had crushed so many lives. The boarding house is on Elm Street, Elias whispered, assuming Ma's still working there. They approached from the back, moving through alleys and shadows. The boarding house was dark except for a single lamp in a ground floor window. Through the thin curtains, Caleb could see movement, a woman washing dishes, her back to the window. That's her, he breathed. That's Ma. Getting her attention without alerting anyone else was the challenge. Elias found a pebble and tossed it gently at the window. Rebecca looked up, confused. Another pebble. She approached the window cautiously, peering out into the darkness. Caleb stepped into the light spilling from the window, pulling down his false beard just enough for her to see his face. Rebecca Vance's mouth opened in shock. Her hand went to her chest, and for a terrible moment Caleb thought he'd given her a heart attack. Then she was moving, rushing to the back door, throwing it open and pulling him inside with strength born of desperation. Caleb? She whispered, her hands on his face, his shoulders, checking that he was real and not some grief-induced hallucination. Elias. But they said you were dead. The newspapers, the railroad, they all said, We let them think that, Ma, Elias said quietly. It's safer if the world believes we're gone. Mary appeared in the doorway, 18 now, and grown into a woman in the years since he'd last seen her. She took one look at her brothers and burst into tears, rushing forward to embrace them both. The reunion was everything Caleb had hoped for and needed. His mother wept and scolded and held them like they were children again. Mary couldn't stop touching them, as if physical contact was the only way to confirm they were real. They talked in desperate whispers, cramming years of separation into stolen minutes. Your father? Rebecca finally asked, though her face said she already knew the answer. Didn't make it, Elias said gently. He died thinking of you, Ma. His last words were your name. Rebecca closed her eyes, fresh tears streaming down her face. I knew. Somehow I knew. I felt it when he passed, like something inside me broke. She looked at her sons. What now? Are you staying? Can you come home? No, Caleb said, and it hurt more than the bullet wound had. We're dead, Ma. That's our only protection. If people knew we survived, the railroad would come after us again. After you and Mary, too. We have to stay dead. Then why come here at all? Mary asked. Why risk it? Because you deserve to know, Caleb said. Caleb what? Deserve to know we made it, that we're okay. We're going to build a new life somewhere quiet, under new names. We'll be happy, Ma. We'll have the peace we fought for, but we can't have it here, and we can't ever come back. Rebecca pulled them close one more time, holding them like she could keep them there through sheer will. Then be safe, she whispered. Be happy. Build families, have children, live long, quiet lives. And know that I love you, that I'm proud of you, that everything you did, right or wrong, you did trying to protect the people you loved. They stayed as long as they dared, which wasn't nearly long enough. As dawn approached and the risk of discovery grew, they had to leave. The goodbye was excruciating, all of them knowing it was final, that they'd never see each other again in this life. Will you write? Mary asked desperately. Even if you can't tell us where you are, just let us know you're alive. We'll find a way, Elias promised. Somehow. But Mary, you have to keep this secret. If anyone knows we survived, everyone's in danger. I understand, she said, though her face was heartbroken. I love you both. Don't forget us. Never, Caleb said. You're the reason we survived everything, the reason any of it mattered. They slipped out the back door into the pre-dawn darkness, leaving their mother and sister behind one final time. Caleb's heart felt torn open, bleeding in ways no wound ever could. But he also felt lighter, unburdened. His family knew he lived, they knew he'd tried. That would have to be enough. They were halfway to the edge of town when the shot rang out. Caleb felt the bullet pass so close to his head, he felt the wind of its passage. He and Elias dove for cover, drawing weapons, scanning for the shooter. Well, well, a familiar voice called from the shadows. The Vance brothers, alive after all. I had a feeling you'd come crawling back eventually. Thornton Webb stepped into view, flanked by 4 armed men. But these weren't his usual hired thugs. These were federal marshals, badges gleaming in the lamplight. You're under arrest, Webb said, smiling that cold smile Caleb had grown to hate. Murder, robbery, assault on federal property, the list goes on. Funny thing, I never quite believed you died in that canyon. Called in some favors, had men watching your mother's place just in case. And here you are, like rats to a baited trap. You're finished, Webb, Elias said. The federal investigation cleared me of all charges, Webb interrupted. Insufficient evidence, they said. Funny how evidence disappears when you've got the right lawyers and the right connections. The Continental Pacific is stronger than ever, and I'm still running operations in this territory. His smile widened. Which means I get to do what I've wanted to do for 3 years. Watch you hang. The marshals moved to surround them, guns drawn. Caleb and Elias were outgunned and out of position. They could fight, probably take a few down with them, but the ending was inevitable. Caleb thought of Lena, waiting at the farm for them to return, thought of the life they'd almost had, the peace that had been so close he could taste it. 3 years of running, fighting, surviving, and it ended here in a redemption alley, betrayed one final time by hope. Don't, Elias said quietly, reading his brother's thoughts. Don't fight. We're done, Caleb. This is the end. Let's face it with some dignity at least. Touching, Webb said. Drop the guns. Now. Caleb's finger tightened on his trigger, calculation racing through his mind. He could shoot Webb, could take that one satisfaction even if it cost him everything. The man who'd destroyed his family, ruined his life, would die too. That was worth something, wasn't it? But then he thought of his mother and Mary, just a few houses away. If he started a gunfight here, stray bullets might find them. Innocent people might die. And after 3 years of violence, he was tired of innocent people dying because of choices he made. He let his gun fall to the dirt. Elias did the same. The marshals moved in, slapping irons on their wrists with practiced efficiency. There we go, Webb said, satisfaction evident in every word. The legendary Vance gang, captured at last. The newspapers are going to love this. Public trial, public hanging, the whole spectacle. Justice finally served. They were marched to the jail, not the flimsy local lockup they'd escaped from before, but a proper federal facility with stone walls and iron bars and guards who knew their business. Caleb and Elias were separated, locked in individual cells, stripped of everything except their clothes and their regrets. For 2 weeks, they sat in those cells while the territory prepared for the trial. Newspapers ran breathless stories about the capture, about the Vance brothers' crimes and the railroad's triumph. Public opinion was mixed. Some saw them as villains who'd gotten what they deserved, others as folk heroes who'd fought against impossible odds. But opinion didn't matter. The law was the law, and the law said they'd hang. Caleb spent those weeks in a strange state of peace. The running was over. The fighting was done. He'd lost everything, but at least he'd fought back. At least he'd made them pay a price, and his mother knew he'd survived, knew he'd tried his best. That was more than most outlaws got. The trial was exactly the circus Webb had promised. The courtroom was packed, reporters scribbling notes, curious onlookers treating it like entertainment. The prosecution laid out a devastating case: robbery, murder, assault, insurrection. Witnesses testified to the Vance gang's crimes, each one adding another nail to the coffin. The defense tried to argue context, tried to explain about the railroad's violence and intimidation, but the judge kept shutting them down. The trial wasn't about why they'd become outlaws. It was about the crimes themselves, the black and white question of guilt or innocence. Guilty, on all counts. Both brothers. Death by hanging, sentenced to be carried out in 1 week. Caleb felt nothing when the verdict came down. He'd known it was coming, had accepted it weeks ago. Beside him, Elias was similarly calm. They'd lived 3 years longer than they had any right to expect. This was just the bill coming due. But on the 6th night before the execution, a curious thing happened. The guard who brought their evening meal was someone Caleb didn't recognize, a young man who moved with nervous energy and kept glancing at the door. "Message for you," the guard whispered, slipping a folded paper through the bars. "From someone who says she knew you. Asked me to deliver it before Friday." Caleb unfolded the paper with shaking hands. The handwriting was Lena's, precise and controlled even through the obvious emotion. "I know what's happening," the letter read. "I know you're going to die, and I know there's nothing I can do to stop it. But I need you to know something, Caleb. You were right to come back, right to see your mother one last time. That's who you really are. Not the outlaw, not the killer, but the son who loved his family enough to risk everything just to let them know he survived. That's the man I fell in love with, and that's the man I'll remember. Not the legend, not the criminal, just Caleb. The railroad took almost everything from you, but they didn't take that. Remember that in your final moments. You chose love over violence at the end. That matters. That's victory, even if it doesn't feel like it. I'll wait for you in whatever comes after this. Until then, be at peace. You fought as hard as any man could. No one can ask for more than that." Caleb read the letter 3 times, tears streaming down his face, before carefully folding it and hiding it in his shirt. Lena was right. He'd chosen love at the end, chosen to see his mother, chosen to spare innocent people in that final confrontation. After years of being pushed into violence, he'd finally chosen a different path. The railroad had taken his land, his father, his brother Thomas, his future. But they hadn't taken his humanity, that he'd held on to by the thinnest of threads, right to the very end. Friday came with sunrise painting the sky in shades of red and gold. Caleb and Elias were led from their cells to the gallows that had been erected in the town square. A crowd had gathered, hundreds of people, some sympathetic, some hostile, most just curious to see the end of a legend. Thornton Webb stood in the front row, his face triumphant. Rebecca and Mary were there too, their faces destroyed by grief but present nonetheless, refusing to let their sons die alone and forgotten. The marshal read the charges and the sentence, asked if they had any final words. Elias spoke first, his voice carrying across the silent crowd. "We were farmers. That's all we ever wanted to be. But the Continental Pacific took that choice from us, burned our neighbors, murdered families, and when we fought back, they called us criminals. History will judge which of us was right. But standing here now, I don't regret fighting. I only regret that we lost." Then it was Caleb's turn. He looked out at the crowd, at his mother's face, at the territory he'd fought to protect and failed to save, and he spoke the truth as he'd come to understand it. "My brother's right. We were farmers who became outlaws because the system failed us. We committed crimes, killed people, robbed and stole. Those are facts. But we did it because peaceful resistance got our friends and family murdered with no consequences. We did it because the law protected the powerful and crushed the weak. We did it because when you have nothing left, violence becomes its own language of protest. He paused, gathering his thoughts. I'm not asking for forgiveness or understanding, but I am asking that people remember why we fought. Not to glorify it, not to romanticize it, but to recognize that when the system fails this completely, when justice becomes just another commodity the rich can buy, desperate people do desperate things. If you want fewer outlaws, build a world where honest people aren't driven to desperation. That's my final testimony. The marshal nodded. The hood was placed over their heads. The noose settled around Caleb's neck, rough hemp that would snap his spine in moments. In the darkness under the hood, he thought of Lena's letter. Thought of choosing love over violence. Thought that maybe, in some way he couldn't fully articulate, he'd won something even in losing everything. The trapdoor opened, and Caleb Vance, farmer's son turned outlaw turned legend, fell into history. The impact was instant and final. No pain, just the sudden cessation of everything. Caleb's last conscious thought was of wheat fields golden in summer sun, of his mother's laughter, of Lena's face when she talked about the future. Then even that faded, and there was nothing. The crowd stood in silence as the bodies swung gently in the morning breeze. Some wept, others cheered, most just stared, bearing witness to the end of a story that had captivated the territory for 3 years. Rebecca Vance collapsed, held up only by Mary's strength. They'd watched their sons die, had witnessed the final price of resistance. But they'd also heard Caleb's words, his refusal to apologize for fighting back, his insistence that context mattered even if the law disagreed. In the weeks that followed, something unexpected happened. Caleb's final testimony was reprinted in newspapers across the territory and beyond. People started questioning the railroad's methods more openly. The federal investigation, though it had cleared Webb of direct charges, had damaged the Continental Pacific's reputation enough that reform became politically viable. New laws were passed regulating eminent domain. Oversight committees were established. The violence that had characterized railroad expansion began to fade as public pressure forced more ethical practices. It was slow change, incremental and imperfect, but it was change nonetheless. The Vance brothers didn't live to see it, but their story, distorted by some into pure heroism, condemned by others as criminal violence, understood by a few as the complicated tragedy it actually was, became part of the frontier's mythology. They were invoked by reformers arguing for better labor protections, by populist politicians railing against corporate power, by outlaws who saw them as martyrs to a righteous cause. Lena Hale never married. She worked her farm alone, helping her community through droughts and hardships, and sometimes late at night she'd read the letter Caleb had never gotten to respond to, remembering the man beneath the legend. When reporters came asking about the Vance gang, she'd tell them the truth. They were desperate men pushed to desperate measures, neither heroes nor villains, but human beings ground up by forces larger than themselves. Rebecca lived another 20 years, keeping a small photograph of her family from before the railroad came. Samuel, Elias, Caleb, and Mary, all smiling in front of the farmhouse that no longer existed. Mary married a school teacher and had 3 children, each of whom grew up hearing stories about the uncles who'd fought the railroad and paid the ultimate price. Thornton Webb prospered for a time, rising in the Continental Pacific hierarchy, but his reputation never fully recovered. He died in 1889, wealthy and powerful, but remembered primarily as the man who'd created the Vance gang through his own brutality. His obituary mentioned his business accomplishments, but the first paragraph noted his role in one of the frontier's most famous tragedies. The Continental Pacific Railroad continued its expansion, bringing commerce and connection to the frontier. Towns grew into cities. The wild lands were tamed. Progress, they called it, and in many ways it was. But it was progress built on graves like the Vances, on families destroyed and communities shattered, on the understanding that resistance, even justified resistance, would be crushed without mercy. Years later, a historian researching the period would visit Lena's farm and ask her the question that everyone eventually asked: were the Vance brothers outlaws or heroes? Lena, old now but still sharp-eyed, had smiled sadly and said, "They were farmers who wanted to protect their family. Everything else, the robberies, the violence, the legend, that was forced on them by people who couldn't imagine any value beyond profit. Were they heroes? I don't know, but they were human, and they fought back when fighting back seemed impossible. That ought to count for something. And perhaps it did. Not in the legal sense, the law had judged them criminals and executed them as such. But in the broader story of how the frontier was won and lost, how progress was achieved, and at what cost, the Vance brothers became a symbol of resistance to unchecked power. Not perfect symbols, not unblemished heroes, but complicated men who'd stood up when standing up meant death. Their graves, unmarked and unremembered in the Redemption Cemetery, became a pilgrimage site for those who saw them as martyrs. Others spat on the ground where they were buried, remembering only the crimes. Most people forgot them entirely, as most people forget most stories once the immediate drama fades. But in certain circles, in certain communities that had suffered similar injustices, the story of the Vance gang endured. Passed down through generations, embellished by some and stripped bare by others, but remembered. Two brothers who'd fought an impossible fight and lost everything, yet had chosen at the end to prioritize love and family over revenge and violence. That choice, more than any robbery or any crime, was their true legacy. In a world that had tried to make them into monsters, they'd managed to die as men. Broken men, defeated men, but men nonetheless, with their humanity intact even if their lives were forfeit. And perhaps that was the only victory available to them. Not triumph over their enemies, not justice in any conventional sense, but the simple act of refusing to become the villains the system insisted they were. They'd fought back against impossible odds, they'd protected the people they loved as long as they could, and they'd died knowing they'd given everything for what they believed was right. The iron rails continued their march westward, indifferent to the lives they crushed beneath them. But somewhere in the Kansas soil, beneath unmarked stones, the Vance brothers rested at last, their war finally over, their story told and retold until legend and truth became impossible to separate. And that in the end was what they'd become. Not men anymore, but legend. A warning and an inspiration, a tragedy and a triumph, depending on who told the story and what lessons they chose to draw from it. The railroad had won the war, but the Vance brothers had won something else. The right to be remembered not as the system had judged them, but as they'd actually been. Imperfect men who'd done terrible things in pursuit of justice that the law refused to provide. Their story would outlive everyone who'd participated in it, would echo through the decades as America grappled with the cost of its own expansion and the price paid by those crushed in progress's relentless advance. That was their legacy. Not victory, not vindication, but witness. They'd been there. They'd fought back. They'd refused to go quietly. And their refusal, amplified through story and song and memory, would inspire others to question authority, to resist injustice, to stand up even when standing up seemed futile. The Vance gang was dead. But the idea of the Vance gang, that ordinary people could fight back against extraordinary power, that would live forever, changing and evolving with each retelling, but never quite disappearing. A ghost haunting the American frontier, reminding everyone who heard the story that the cost of progress was measured in more than dollars and rails. It was measured in lives, in families, in the dreams of farmers who just wanted to work their land in peace and were destroyed for daring to resist when that peace was stolen. Caleb Vance had wanted to be remembered. Not as an outlaw, not as a legend, but as someone who'd fought for what he believed was right. History, in its complicated way, granted him that wish. Whether it was victory or defeat, justice or tragedy, depended entirely on who was telling the story and what they needed it to mean. But the story endured. And in enduring, it transformed from history into myth, from fact into meaning, from the death of two brothers on a Kansas gallows into something larger than any single life or death could contain. The legend of the Vance gang. Born in injustice, raised in desperation, and died refusing to apologize for fighting back. That was the price of becoming a legend. Your life ends, but your story never does.